have bosses who aren't as fit as you, or people who are like, what, you bike to work and you think you're fitter than I am? And so like the whole fit shaming, the whole boss
We're
is
gonna
like,
try to
what are
help
you
them figure
doing?
out
Either
what success
encouraging
look
you
like
and
for
you're
their
kind of
region,
like, ooh,
and then
look
hopefully
at
set up
this,
some
and
studies
mom
so
and
we
boy,
can collect
or
actual
going,
empirical
why were
data
you
and
late, or why were
And
you doing
you'll-
something?
Either way, it's kind of weird, actually. Even
Right,
the encouragement's kind of weird.
yeah, the
Yeah.
encouragement's weird, and then when your bike
well,
at work
yeah.
set up,
and
and people come and go with your
re-enroll in
bike,
school
and they feel
and
like,
have access to the UT lab.
so like,
No, I'm
I
kidding.
actually really
no, I'm
realize
hoping
that there's
to
a lot of
actually
social
get this
issues
out
when
in
it
some
comes to
way
doing
through
something a little
some
off the
medium
norm,
and academic
whether it's
journals.
good for you
So you
or
like
not,
starting at home?
right?
We
And
can't,
so
like the IC Squared Institute,
how
so
do
they
you,
publish all their stuff
norm
through their
that
social
at
media.
work without making some
So
people
that's
who
one
aren't
way.
fit
I would
I see.
ashamed
Yeah.
about the fact that they are driving a car?
Yeah. Were there any
Years ago
like
in,
big
the
like
startup
I
scene
don't
in
know
Austin,
outcomes?
actually,
So
they
we
helped
weren't
form it
able
back
to
in the
kind of
1980s.
I mean, it's literally
amalgamate
IC
all
squared
these
is
ideas.
IC
But
Squared,
what I would love to do
You guys
is
know Art Markman
test it with
from,
like a survey or
you guys
something.
know-
Oh, yeah.
Like, so you can get a rank order, or maybe do like,
Yeah, that
That's
he's
the-
in Art's lab.
the lab that I'm in.
some fun, fancy statistics.
But thank you for asking that
know.
question.
Well, there's like a
Accessible to the public
what's
is
it
very
called?
important.
Love to Bike, I think.
So we'll do our best
Does
to
a ton of
get
like
out there.
monthly, maybe like 2 or 3 monthly like bike encouragement things.
Right.
And so Biketober is finally coming up.
Okay.
And so that would involve probably a lot of first time.
Yeah, I think the
riders.
interesting thing would be
And
somehow the
social,
social situation at work needs to
How about
be
yourself? What brings you out tonight?
Just moved here
in
from
concert with all the safety
Welcome.
stuff, because a lot of bike people
I'm
talk
trained as an
about the
architect,
safety
and then-
part of it, but there's all these other aspects of it, like even leaving early to go to work, if you
Yeah,
have
we're
a
very
partner, and they're like,
interested in
why aren't we having coffee anymore?
Yeah,
Or,
yeah.
hey, I have to drop off the kids
Realms of
at
design.
home. Or, hey,
So
you
we
know,
have,
like,
a
XYZ
lab
doesn't open
associated
until
with
this
this,
time,
and
you
we
can't
had
leave at
a-
this, so there's like,
Yeah.
Architect
there could be
seat
partner pressure
with them
and kid
that's
pressure and
focusing
things
on
like that
Well,
as
in
well.
Texas, I mean, Austin's a little bit different, but like I live in Mountain City and work in San Marcos. I'm like, probably not gonna do 25 miles on a bike.
So,
you know?
right, so we were talking about people who would actually just be candidates
But
for
it's
this.
probably
So
that
usually the
more
candidates are
analogy
between
for
2 and 4
the past
miles,
than we
according to
did.
TechStop.
But
So we're not, you're not a candidate for
Yeah.
biking to work,
Limited to colors.
unfortunately.
But still, there's still probably like some
Light,
kind
air,
of
colors.
medium something, like where you park and you're kind of close to
Not
campus, but you
quite
still
as-
bike to campus. You know how the buses
Yeah.
have the bike
Yeah.
racks on the front,
Yeah.
but that's, that already, that sounds like a lot of hassle, you
Right.
know, to like park and then still not be where you're going,
Right.
you know, but I don't know.
And then another person was talking about how, well, what if you want to bike to work and you don't want to bike home because the temperature biking to work is
Yeah.
fine,
And
and
the
the temperature coming
painted
back
pink.
is, you know, so
And
like,
he's like,
how do
"You
we
have
make
got to be
biking,
kidding
so
me."
that was a little
Somebody
more
submitted that
logistical
purchase record,
thinking.
right?
But we were trying to
Contract
focus just on
painted
social to
pink.
make people think socially,
No.
when they had previously
Totally.
only been
Yeah.
thinking
Colors are
logistics,
Yeah.
making
Yeah.
the streets safer, and thinking from this very high
you,
surface level.
independent or you?
But what if we think of
No,
just
I'm
about
independent.
the small
I
social
moved my
level
family here a
within the
couple years
company
ago.
that the
I
person
have
is?
16-year-old.
Yeah, I've been looking at that because there's a concept that's mostly used for schools.
And this is where everything's
It's called
happening.
bike train, and it's just like,
Fantastic.
you know, at this time, we'll be
I
at
grew
this
up in New Caney,
intersection, and this
Connecticut,
time
the
we'll be this
Harbor
intersection.
5.
And
We
so
changed
what,
all the markets.
it's the ability for you to
So,
ride
this
in a
is
clump,
very
which like even with
specific.
2,
It's
you're like
safer.
twice as safer, and then it just gets more and more.
And architecture,
And so,
people don't think of it.
It's like you
It's
know,
like
this bike
carpooling,
train,
like
yeah, it's
bike
like,
pooling
yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah, it's like a safety, it's like a school of fish kind of thing, right? Like
Oh,
safety
yeah.
numbers.
Yeah.
You
Comes out
you are
of-
less likely to get hit because you're the size of a car, it's
Yeah.
5 cycles.
Yeah.
And so, it's a little cumbersome, and I was looking at like a software thing that would help, but,
No, you
Help you
don't.
find riders around you, like ways,
Yeah.
yes, you could save so much
I
money in
developed-
carpool and be like, ha ha ha.
Yeah.
You know, like,
Yeah.
no, actually I couldn't because I have to be at work at this certain time, I'm not gonna drop 10 people off,
right.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're really pushing the carpool thing. They did
They
an event in
are.
Austin lately,
They are.
and I think it's smart.
Design
I
architect.
think it's
I mean,
awesome if you
UX
don't
architect.
have an hour-long
So,
commute.
Yeah.
If you have a shorter
Well, in the
commute, then
UX
you can have a little
world,
more flexibility, right?
Architect instead
You
of
leave
doing
slightly
the
earlier,
architect of the
but I have an hour
product
commute
instead of
from
being
Lakeway and to
hands-on and
Louis.
exactly how
So-
to
You're not gonna like add time to it,
No,
right?
I
Mm.
can't
But of
add
course,
more time.
I came up with the
Yeah.
flip side of that.
I saw a biker
Architectural
outside this building
user
today getting
experience
a
designer
like screaming match
work on
with the car.
buildings.
I think they just kind of,
Experience.
I don't think he actually hit him, but I think it was
Yeah.
close and the dude
Yeah.
was like screaming at that car. And that's for everybody to like take notice of.
Yeah.
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 Well, you were talking about,
But that-
It's relatively
we can take these
recent.
problems and look at them
If
from,
you've ever.
you know, engineering or fear or safety or logistics or whatever. Because whenever I was studying MRSA, the staph infection that people can get in hospitals or that they can get, whatever, you're a gym or whatever.
Yeah.
We were studying like epidemiology because this is when
I
I was at the
forget you
VA.
also do healthcare.
Yeah. So this was when I worked at the VA, and we were studying. That's why I went to the CDC because we were doing social factors that influence spread, not epidemiology, right? We can swab and we can find out those things, but this was like, the priest, don't ever touch the Bible in a hospital because sick people touch that, and so it
whenever it
always.
gets my prescription filled, I try not to touch anything.
Don't touch the
I'm going to a
magazines.
Jeremy
Yeah,
place.
don't touch the magazines.
Nothing in the doctor's office. I'm like this. I'm like this.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm
I
sad
just
to
want a
miss
mask.
the
I don't
You
need
never,
it, but I
you
do.
never know how long it can
Yeah.
exist on a surface, right?
MRSA is 48 hours.
Oh,
Really?
sorry?
Yeah.
Another hour now.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm
Ongoing.
I'm the friendliest one you
kind of
meet.
torn.
This is our Dr. Fox, our senior. Jamie.
Awesome.
Have you been before?
We
Dr.
Oh,
Fox.
yeah.
But there are some really luminary activists.
Yeah, I
Some
come,
by community
I come every
activists.
time, but
Sort of,
it's,
seniority of people who showed up, like, when I didn't know.
Well, they did it.
Something I was like, oh
Marketing
man.
Sorry.
We had some,
I was like, that's a whole other hour. I could talk on that. So we'll just come back in different times.
Oh, good.
I'll just, if you want, I was like really the like actual how-to portion
So
of
the
my
one in the red room.
Yeah.
as well
I
as
love that's
to
days.
But
to,
you
uh,
just
designer
mentioned
from
in your
the city,
previous
so.
story
Oh,
how you
cool.
already did a mindset intervention
then,
from an incident
they
report
really,
to a learning review.
Yeah.
So that takes the risk, the perceived
significant,
emotional risk, incident
activists.
report versus
So
learning
cool.
review,
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
completely different. Right?
Yeah.
you know,
Yep.
I think
And I
that's
have
Afterwards,
really,
I was like,
that's a
okay,
learning.
ton of
teach
the
me
names. We like shed
how
them
you would
in,
approach
in
those
search of trying to
situations.
change this culture.
Were
And so
they?
there's been
what
different
were they? Was it the
iterations
first
of
time
that same
that was some of the
process,
behavioral
but
design stuff,
yeah,
or
it's
some of it
I love
cool,
that.
but the
for
story stuff
cycling
is
stuff? Was
that's
the first
2
time they
days of
advanced
the
those, that kind
Yeah.
workshop that I
Yeah,
go to,
exactly.
training
So-
people about storytelling, and I was like,
yeah, it was a
I
really
had
good,
some of it in here. I was like, I
I think
can't
we
do that in
turned
5
over some
minutes,
new
so
things.
I was like,
I
maybe a
love
different
that.
day.
I love storytelling.
Approaching,
Well, because she's the communication.
approaching the issue, which is basically, a lot of
and persuasion.
pulling out the research of the everyday
So,
problem
I
solving,
think your storytelling
like
is
stuff
sort
that's
of
important.
It's fun. It's the
In fact,
most
Jonathan's
fun.
trying to
One
get
thing that I
me,
emphasized, because we knew going in that
The IC
that
square is
there's heated opinions on both
corporate
sides.
storytelling.
Oh,
Because he's like, do you want to hear my
Well,
there's
Well,
don't come in my office.
wrote
We
all
need to call it
kinds of
corporate storytelling,
Right.
persuasion, and then we'll pay
And in
for
fact,
it.
there's
Otherwise,
Corporate storytelling sounds dirty.
well,
But you know what, we have,
we need to brand it in some
Enterprise
way.
story, well, it's like storytelling.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, oh, there you go, there you go, innovative
Top
storytelling.
level real quick, and now
Yeah.
it's just that the bikers are very aware of how dangerous
That's
the
awesome.
bikers are.
Well, you have to have a
Kill them
hundred.
if they-
Huge
Yeah,
challenge, like the broadband is like,
Yeah.
it's
Kill.
everywhere.
That's why I come back to
And
myself, it's
the
okay.
driver is
Everyone.
Yeah, always.
red lights and
Have you been
getting
doing
away when
have one.
Yes.
So, but then what are the,
Well, so I went to this TEDx conference
Yeah.
in
The
Portland
big
for
one
this
from
introduction, and
back
about
early,
4 of the speakers
early
spoke about
was
this challenge of broadband, like,
that was
accessible.
between the vehicular side
I guess take it for
and
granted
the,
here,
I'm excited. So are you,
COVID areas.
Oh, yeah.
worked outside of, like,
Hey.
your
So
learnings
there
come
was,
from?
Are you here?
From Texas State? I'm just looking at it.
I teach at Texas State, but I also work for the Force Students. So I do 2 different kinds of jobs, and actually that one helps me with that one, and that one helps me with that one.
Like a light.
Yeah,
So this one's
Yes.
in there. Real world work.
Makes the students understand,
Yeah.
They're like, whatever can I do? I'm like,
pretty much anything. So I'm certified in actual
he probably just walked in and started talking to him and then
So it's like 900,000.
you feel like he's ready to holler.
Yeah, it's like,
Embrace the story.
It's done well. I was in the field for that's the really big question, that's a great point, what works in, say, Copenhagen is not gonna work in Texas, every place is very different, so it has to be differently. And the problem is maybe me as a
I've been in the field for all these different things.
from my perspective, if you don't have standardization, because everybody's trying to race crazy bikes, so nobody knows what it is.
Yeah, the bike stop sign.
And I was like,
Right.
or is it a class? I was like, the transition from looking at like board as like safety culture kind of thing to
Remember when you did that meeting?
I was like, none of what we're talking about.
Here's the project you're
There
doing.
are people dying.
What are we doing?
Yeah,
We're like talking about this spreadsheet.
multi-year-long project to roll
It's in
out.
communication.
So I got into it because I had
more
for,
biking.
I studied social skills.
Rolling out new bikes,
how much I
trails
was
and
like,
things like and paths.
So basically,
More,
it's
yeah,
intuition.
it just really,
with
It's
a
but in that process,
a
I
website
Uh,
for
Maybe
employees to do another employee.
at the event, I'm not closely connected to it,
I kind of
but I knew
together
I wanted this
A longer,
Under Armour, I wanted to do something.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound
time,
like
you know, like, all these things
So-
in construction were all about
people
people.
who take action
They,
are the same kinds of
they're
things.
so,
that
they're all
figure out how to
hardcore.
They have like
Right, well, yeah, exactly.
They're
Well,
all like,
and
a lot of the activists on the former
right, in a helicopter, so there's like, there's extreme versions of communication.
cycle people,
Situation.
people who like maybe bike to work but aren't like.
Or like you double down on like.
Yeah, their specialty is.
So, whatever, right, so I had, yeah, it's many departments, it's a multi-disciplinary.
Stressor was interested in how it is to often went up against investigations or
Sport, that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The program wasn't even established by,
We've got all these really important,
Like now, they snubbed us. So they didn't want to talk to us at all. We weren't standing up and we're defending them, we're defending our rights.
but you can learn to run.
You guys are hurt.
It's a real fight.
So that was the really sure how that problem before the Hampton, and so I asked
Are you presenting our research?
people have lost like, oh,
What are these Western students? What are these? And so, but they were like,
wait,
telling me they're learning, you know, and I kept just saying, okay,
but so I asked like,
so I was
that
saying yes to
happens,
very scary opportunities
or
and not knowing if I
deal
was
with
going to be
anybody
able
in that
to
level.
and then I just got a
The
text
other
right
stuff,
then.
but we also said about from the very beginning, let's
Shot. So I'm like, okay, I'll do that. What are we talking about? I say yes and yeah.
there's tribalism involved, and there's also.
That's, you know, that it was like a winding process.
The whole point of this is that
In
we're
2015.
basically every human cognitive faculty is way worse
So
than
that way I was talking about it.
we're really good at not seeing it
Outsider, I
ourselves
can like hear.
due to biases and justifying our own rationalizing. We're very good at seeing it in others and not saying, oh, it's because of the rail that I have
No, I
as
mean,
well,
I have
or
like,
it's situational. We go straight to it's moral.
I have all
They're
kinds
the
of.
wrong kind of, they're not they're lazy, they're
I
telling you
have
they're ignorant,
hard
they're
hats.
wrong language, race, wrong
I
culture, wrong
can talk to
religion.
you about how to.
And so that is, if it's a moral problem, then it's
You know,
not
it's just
solvable
area,
discussion.
Area,
You have to get,
They also
so,
But it's fun.
this is,
And it's
exactly what happens in
So
any
that,
solution designing.
that's every day.
Like, if you've been on team, you know, I mean, it doesn't matter what,
Yeah.
what would we do?
They were, yeah.
Solve some problem, right? And at some point, you're like, they're not using it the way I do.
That path to like.
All this knowledge, like the school, you built this thing.
Yeah, but I guess the master's was like,
Boys
like,
got
like,
to their
like,
point,
like,
and start to
emphasis
get
and
aggro about it.
I was studying.
That's the point at which we start to come face to face with our own cognitive biases.
Well, I was studying, I mean, I was
All these
teaching, you know, like,
And it manifests
small group
as like,
communication, so I didn't know which citizen I was.
that's exactly the flag.
I really
This
started
is,
like.
now we're getting something.
And that's what I know.
This is a
hunger.
blind
I,
spot. I'm getting basically
We're
starting
totally
to,
dominant.
starting to like
He
plan
started
their
doing that, right?
So, yeah, that was, yep, 1310 for us, but
That's the
I,
moment.
Anyone did.
so then I was.
I'm getting, I'm starting to moralize
architects
I'm
focus
missing
in, that was
And
what's
so we
actually
got, he
played.
has chemistry.
I've seen a bit of that.
Physics ideas in there.
It's like there were segments of like type of
PhD
cyclists.
and just kept
It's
saying,
like
I didn't know this, but apparently like a lot of flex communities like, oh, these big tech companies coming in here, littering and taking up our public bike racks. And then on the other side, everyone already hates the
that
shoes,
was
it's
getting
just
me
rides
already
there.
kind of.
And it's like, Jesus, like they're just a bike. They're using the same, this is like your big shot to line up with the same number of things. So,
I agree.
Exactly. Two other people in our town. Yeah.
So there's,
Yep, that's like, this is the, it's funny because
The
this is
checklist don't work necessarily.
a lot of time in college.
Code is there, but also the Bobcat joint
Well,
here.
there's
You don't think that's how you work?
Yeah, you know, like a vampire could be out, you know, cause like, so my academic people were like, well, you know, you get out of college, you're gonna be good.
I love it. I hate academic stuff.
Right, so if you wanna be in the middle, both groups are gonna think
Whatever
about
way
where they are.
Like
Like, yeah, exactly, well, it's kinda like, yeah, but you can't talk to each other, I have to be here, cause you know, like, I can say, it's
Big allies.
rewarding
They don't have, they don't have the whole baggage of.
yeah.
So I think potentially it's a really, really as much as I don't, as much as I don't like the idea of someone coming in and just,
Right.
throwing a
Yeah.
product on something
There
which
is,
which they are.
they're usually in psychology or psychology and education, so it's organizations were really for us.
So,
Yeah,
so,
and, right, oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, a lot of it is the same, but instead of
But to be
treating
fair,
education as kind
cities have
of,
been.
well, we're studying this, they were saying education, we're like, it's all the
Pushing
so
the
we
issue.
have the isolation as
We're
like,
working on site.
you want to start a business,
and then communication, we're like, no, no, come on.
and then he
It's
creates
the cognition, you know?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly, so it's
Simpler
a.
kind of on-ramp.
Yeah, that's true. And in Texas, I mean, a lot of people would, even if they wouldn't break a sweat, they would assume they would break a sweat using like scooter. It's like, oh, I'm not gonna so like,
No, I can't really because I just wanted to do exactly that.
well, there's been twice, like just today, I'm putting something in the map with like some like charging station kind of those running car. We've got
No, I just run the one up and
I don't know what the number was, 2,000, you know, per month to the charging station. And then they're like, oh, that's cool. Well, it, despite all the backlash, 4,000 trips a day happen on same time period happen on a scooter. And one's hyper regulated and one's subsidized.
Yeah, it's rocks,
heavily,
but the interesting part is how do you find the rocks?
And that's really the
What's the story that they're talking about? That's the interesting part. And otherwise you pick up and go, oh, yeah.
exactly all the stuff.
until, you know,
But you got these little funky scooters.
Or you live to a magnet.
Inside,
So
there's
you're
a
in a
magnet.
magnet.
There's everything in there.
It's
They
crazy
will get
because
some pretty fast too.
that
That
user
on
experience was
top
on
of the
what is it, you know?
We know what
No.
That's in the south.
So you have to
So that
be
means
really
it's
careful
different.
with those terms.
Right there, yeah.
We now know,
I'm a little bit.
yeah, so there's matter that is dark, and then there's dark matter.
dark matter is
Dark matter is a component that makes up
Oh,
the
yeah.
I'm always, my bias is.
and it impacts traffic. Well, then there's the matter that is dark that we can't observe because it doesn't have photons coming out of it. Lots of
I'll admit my bias. I just got shot by a bike.
just
I'll push off the road by a car.
My aunt
they
It
found
didn't hit me, but
your
the
bike's
reason I swerved, yeah, when I was driving. So that's my, no, on
however it is they do that.
no.
What they did was they did was
No, it was, I think it was mixed because like, I was thinking that he was in the passenger left anyway, so I gave up turning left and brake, and having to brake right on top of like big, perfectly smooth metal, they put a hole in it.
They then took
Huge brains are extremely powerful.
about
Yeah.
good
So
shoulder
we're not really,
spots and
we're not really capable of driving
they
cars.
have
Yeah.
So
There's a reason.
in a way that
amplified
they can train
the
them.
Country that,
People want
So
to
they
say
amplify the effect
Hard
of
to
the
see
way
ways
to be measured.
that's way too lofty. There's like
So you know what's
little nursing students who like just don't.
So when I just-
it's not.
So,
Spot
so
right
we
now.
develop
You know,
photographs and
maybe
paint
someday,
that
but
are
even now,
DLSR
it
and
must
a
be
big
getting
ass
better.
telescope.
because they take data.
We take short pictures like a few minutes, because that's how good the mounts are.
Have room
The mount is tracking the stars as they
Yeah,
measure.
so that's a
And
So like what do they do? Oh yeah, like extra
like,
video.
yeah, and it sounds sexy, we want to put them in it, and then I was like,
So we have occasional pull-outs,
So
you know,
we like to
even if
tell when we get close to
like that,
taking it up, and we
that's
saw
really
that
good.
there's a strap
behind you,
Everyone's
and
like, I think lots of,
you know,
and do
Yeah.
that
like if like a truck is going out of control down over.
Kind of is,
down
except it's
there.
Oh,
They
the
have a-
sand
you know,
ramp.
they have
That's right.
nothing moves, it's out
Yeah,
the same.
yeah.
Ones
So,
that exist.
and then we stack, then we add those up, and all those photos, and then we run those through the
Well,
map,
that's
come up with an image.
also an issue with
And that's what they did. They took each of these individual things and
Yeah.
scaled them correctly, stacked them on top of each other, so that
Yeah,
we
I've
could separate
heard of
them.
this.
firefighters die.
Like I get on the shooter stuff, like
So the answer is,
especially like the water and stuff like
so they now have a
but it
measure.
seems like
Sorry,
Is that, is that?
oh sorry,
Part of that is,
people don't like doing cuts, especially on
Right.
content. People who write them are not used to whatever the
Sorry to
rules
go
are.
Yeah.
Well, because you know what people do, I know what I get
Right.
when
I'm sure the bike sharing business, you know, a lot of people I know are like,
Oh, yeah.
you know, never ride a bike.
I will be on
city.
Oh,
Yeah, well that actually that is true for that. I think the last
Should we get started? It's not gonna get better. You know, like each time catastrophic storm, major fires, big fires. Nice to see you, Brian.
Alex, how do you find?
I have experience with things like
All kinds of cool
LibreOffice right now.
That's all the really this is. It's just all a point of pictures so that I can tell stories.
Oh, really?
Exactly. Well, helicopter, that's yours.
Helicopter.
Yeah. Look at the research you have made a helicopter. Like, they're researching hard. Like a hard hat. Yes, we're doing it. Oh, we're embedded with the church. Exactly. See, we're out there doing it.
I use Microsoft Office 2008.
Hey, welcome. We're gonna get started. Hey, I'm
And
not
it's like, I can't figure out how to use my thing. What's wrong with me?
No surfer just like
Yeah, I like that. Quality, quality, yes, exactly. Well, if I get, well, and if we get it right, then they'll come back.
But it's a case where your interface like this
in my opinion, I wrote
Cool.
like how you set these up.
Are they live casting?
I asked her if y'all.
they're gone now, and thankfully they're out.
So everybody wants to grab a seat, probably here to get started.
I don't think like that. Oh, yeah, then that will be, yes,
and
fame, right there.
radius. Yeah.
Woo. That was loud.
We're working on the live stream here, so just because you're in the right place, you can still chat a little bit. Got a couple minutes, but now you're in the right spot.
On Thursday, your homework is due.
what are you teaching this semester?
Pro Sim.
Nice. Yeah, Evan is so excited that he's teaching again.
Oh, yeah, no, you have to come back. It's
Tell
the
him to wear a
one
belt
day.
this time. I don't know if
Like, 'cause one guy came and he had an
Binder,
airline.
what's that?
Yeah, oh, I know. I was like, it's, it's 3 rings or whatever. This guy brought in the, what I would call field notes notebook with the little spiral this big to take notes. I was like, oh, bless you, yeah, aren't you adorable? We're gonna start right there. He also, same guy, emailed me 20 minutes before class to ask if I'd print out his paper for him. I was like, and then I tried to give him a like, oh, I was like, I think you meant this for someone else. He was like, no, I meant it for you. And I was like, oh, wow.
I guess we're gonna start seeing more of that. It's
legally
hey,
2 years ago, I think.
Yeah. I keep on waiting for them to, yeah, what was your name again?
Heather Watson.
But I'm gonna wear that. There's no more like, I can't believe I'm doing that.
Trying to
Let's just
visualize
leave it
that
right
for
here.
me.
You think they could find
A little bit of everything.
I know.
Yeah, and give us the link to the live cast.
Yeah.
Right when they start broadcast time.
Oh,
So you can allocate real time.
oh, I gotcha.
Alright.
Is there a clicker or will I need to use the computer?
Oh, we can get, I've got one.
That is not it.
Sparky, you don't have yours with you?
I might.
Oh, this is the true nerd test right here. If you have that and dry erase markers in your bag, that's like a bingo.
I do have the driver's license. And Post-it notes.
traveling center bingo.
Yeah, traveling presenter bingo.
Got three
I can
If
hit the
it has
button up
one,
there.
I'll go check.
They do have one too.
I can hit this button.
I
This
know,
isn't a
because
big
I
deal.
think
Oh, wait, I do have one.
had to replace it. Anyway,
Heather.
We have one.
oh, there we go. Thanks, Sparky. I have mine, but it seems that somewhere.
It's just, it'll be loud if I walk up the beach.
Sorry, I'm clicking.
All right. So, thanks for coming out to Action Design ATX meetup we have every month at this same time. We are varying locations, so keep an eye on that because now Under Armour has invited us to come there anytime as well. So we're still trying to figure out pros and cons of the two places. Most of you have been here before, it seems, so you have a rough idea, so I won't belabor the beginning, but roughly the facts are out and all the research around our brains, and it turns out that all of our cognitive capabilities suck compared to what we thought they were, and therefore how we...
Speak for yourself, Ron.
Except for Heather.
Except for me.
So, that has huge implications on how we approach solving all kinds of world problems. And in fact, the most, despite what you see on the news and everywhere else, the most dangerous thing to you in your life is yourself, because we all have such a hard time actually following through on the things we know are good for us. So, and most of us theoretically are in business or in research or in policy or in places to do something to help others. And the frustration is constantly this gap between why isn't it working, why isn't it working? Well, it turns out we need a more nuanced understanding of how our brains work and how to design to that. So that's action design, that's behavioral economics, that's behavioral design, behavior design, whatever you want to call it. That's what we're here to discuss. Gamification, gameful design, all kinds of strategies for how do we get better outcomes. And one of those, that tendency to error basically guarantees that whatever plans we have to make things better for ourselves, for our teams, for our family, for the world, it's screwed up. Guaranteed, you're going to fail. That's just something that if you want to be successful, if you want to really succeed, you have to really learn to eat failure for lunch and suck the best out of it. You have to, it's a mantra now in startups and needs to be everywhere else. It's having a really hard time getting into big institutions. You've got to fail forward fast and just know that there's critical failures and go in not trying to hide them, but to find them fast and deal with them and learn from them. So we're very honored tonight to have an expert in that,
Yes,
which Heather will
this
introduce.
is Dr. Rebecca Fox. I met Dr. Fox because she is one of the leading researchers down at Texas State, and I met her at a research pitch competition that I was judging. And so the idea there is that we pool a bunch of professors together, and they come up with a multidisciplinary research idea, and they pitch it to the community, and the community gets involved, and people fund it, and so that's where I met Dr. Fox, and love her work on failure, because we talk a lot in action design about failure recovery. And we can do that on a personal scale, like when you're doing a website design, or you're trying to get people to do some pathways where they need to do a bunch of steps to get to an outcome, and what happens when they fall off the bandwagon. She's an expert at failure recovery on more of a bigger scale, so on more of an organizational scale. And anyway, I'll let you take it away from here. But she's in the field all the time saving people's lives through research.
That is big. Thank you. Thank you, Heather, for inviting me and for hosting.
Yeah.
I'm just going to get right into it because part of explaining the ideas I want to share with you will include a little bit more of an introduction of what I do. So, a couple of things. Can we learn from our failures? And we say unintended outcomes because if we want to embrace the fact that we can get something out of them, that failing can be productive, that word doesn't give us space for that. So usually we kind of open it up and say unintended outcomes. And so yes, the answer is yes, but it's not easy. And I'm going to share with you quite a bit about what I've learned in different areas, healthcare, but then mostly within firefighting. So I'm going to start with, who am I to tell you, right? Why would you listen to me about this? Some current learning efforts by the United States Forest Service. How learning doesn't just happen. So we worked on a title, myths and secrets, and that might have pulled you in. So I'm going to kind of talk about how we think that everyone just is a natural learner and that you would just embrace it, and if you messed up, you would go, okay, I won't do that again. But that's not really a model that captures the complexities associated with learning. And then I'm going to talk about just culture and storytelling as the secrets to the successes that we've had with trying to create a learning culture. And then I'm going to move from fire to the factory, and that was just me trying to be punny about talking about fire, but then now we're here at the Capitol factory, and so how we can, see? The money right there. How we can actually change or think about what I'm going to tell you on a large scale with an organization where we're trying to get people to learn lessons all across the nation, and how that might be able to translate. And that's actually the part where you're going to help me. I feel like this is a very interactive space, and it's meant to be like that, so I don't have to have all the answers, but we can generate them together. And then, if we have time at the end, I will kind of bring you into an activity that I use with the firefighters, trying to help them to embrace storytelling and just culture and those things. But to start out with, I wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about who I am. I teach organizational communication classes, I teach rhetoric and resilience classes, persuasion, environmental communication, lots of different undergrad and graduate courses at Texas State. Primarily, the one that overlaps the most with what I do with Forest Service has to do with organizational learning, and particularly with resilience. So the idea that if we don't create space to learn from our unintended outcomes, that there's no way for us to embrace or actually to become more resilient. And believe me, I'm not the first one who's been doing this. This has been an effort. We've been doing a version of this for many years within the Forest Service, and so I'll kind of capture a little bit of that history too. But I also go out and I serve on, I'm a qualified firefighter, but I also go out and I serve as a learning expert in the field. So I go out onto scenes where there's ongoing incidents. For instance, I just got back from Oregon and Washington and California, where I was for 36 days in the field, going from incident to incident. So from different fires where there have been I investigated a tanker rollover. So a guy was driving a water tanker way up in the mountains and got on a soft shoulder and flipped that thing down the mountain about 150 feet. He lived, but he's also wrecked 2 helicopters, so I'm kind of like, maybe this is not for you. Gardening? I don't know, something else. But that's what we're learning is you should not be in control of the heavy machinery. But I could go from one fire to the next, and within the span of 5 to 7 days, and investigate a bunch of different incidents like that. So I'll tell you more about those as we go, but I think it's important for you to know about me that I'm in the classroom and I'm teaching, and that helps me to hone my skills about communication. So when I go talk to firefighters, they know that I'm not just making this up and it's not kind of flash in the pan, but that it's grounded in history and theory and all those kinds of things. But then also going through the guard school and getting qualified as a firefighter allowed me to be able to do this with a little bit more authenticity. And so I work to speak both languages, and that's part of what has allowed me to be successful. That and embracing exactly the ethos of that quote, which is half the time I say I'm going to do something, it's horrifying because I'm not quite sure if I'm going to be able to pull it off. And so I live in this place between being excited about things that are happening and always kind of surrounded with what we would feel like is a failure. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I kind of balance that too. So the current learning efforts that we embrace within the Forest Service, this is actually a very rich and mature kind of area within the Forest Service. You might not know that this kind of learning is the focus, but there are major initiatives within the Forest Service to learn from unintended outcomes. We have multiple workshops each year that train people from type 2 firefighters that are, digging line all the way up to incident commanders about how to embrace the learning culture. And so we have different kinds of learning efforts, and we have the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center, which is a place where it's open to the public. You can go look at any of these learning documents. So if we have small reviews because there was a small incident, maybe no one was killed, or maybe it wasn't even a near miss, but we have a quick lesson that we want to share, anyone within the Forest Service can hit that button and share a lesson. And it's going to get vetted through the Lessons Learned Center because sometimes people need help with their writing. People didn't necessarily sign up. Oops. Is that button working? I see it. And then I don't.
Laser pointer?
Yeah, it doesn't go on the thing.
So great.
Oh, good God. Well, you can see the firefighters right there. I'm literally right here. I can point to it. I don't know. I'm like, we'll never be able to figure it out. But like, these folks probably didn't get into fire because they're like, you know what I want to do? I want to write reports. Right? That's not what motivated them to get into fire. It's not quite as interesting. So we have some editing and those kinds of things that we do at the Lessons Learned Center. But this is a place where we can go and we can archive and we can look through and find out what trends are in safety. So, you can start to understand that something's not an isolated event if 10 people across the nation are writing about it at the same time. And so we can actually look at data and do something with data. The danger is to produce all these things and not do anything with it, and that happens a lot. That's usually when they bring in, researchers, learning experts, and those kinds of things. So at this Lessons Learned Center, we have RLS, that's a rapid lesson sharing, and that's a kind of document that we can go out and do and we can produce pretty quickly. We want them to be roughly 6 to 8 pages, and it can be, I've done one, there was a hiker rescue that I was recently a part of, and that no one was hurt, but it was a really interesting lessons learned opportunity, and so went in and interviewed everyone that was involved in that, and captured the lessons that we could share from that. I'm also doing another one, the tanker rollover. That one is much more complex because whenever incident management teams come in and they're fighting fire, like most people don't understand that the local fire department doesn't fight wildfire. These are massive interagency organizations that come in through the Forest Service, and they're going to link together tons of different resources that maybe local resources wouldn't be able to do. They just have horsepower that local resources don't have. And so you've seen a police drama on television where the case gets so big that the FBI comes in and they're like, it's our case now, right? There's always static right there. That's something I think is very interesting. But those local resources and then the national teams that come in to manage them, this particular fire where the tanker rolled off the hill, the guy that was in the tanker, he called 911, but with incident management teams, we have our own emergency services. Like we have our own EMTs and firefighters and everyone else, and so you don't call the local 911. So local 911 responded to an incident within our incident, and so it was super complicated and required rappellers to try and go down and get this guy who was about 350 pounds, which was very nerve-wracking because he's a big dude to try and get out of there on ropes, but they couldn't get a hoist ship in, they couldn't get a short haul in, so they had to rappel. It was very complicated, so it takes a while to do all the interviews to get all the lessons learned, but there was a good outcome. There was no fatalities or anything like that. So that's a kind of one type of document. The other one are these the FLA teams. Those are facilitated learning analyses. These are much more in-depth. When we train firefighters through the learning from unintended outcomes workshops, we're training them to do these facilitated learning analyses. And that means a team is constructed. Usually you have a team leader, an editor, somebody who's going to do the writing. Then you have subject matter experts. So if it's a aircraft problem, if it's a chainsaw problem, you'll bring in experts in those areas. And you interview everyone that was involved in the incident. And you're working to gather lessons from them. But that is a much more formal process. So the whole point of telling you this is that learning can be done on small things and then also on these large-scale fatalities and things like that. One example of a smaller one that I was sharing earlier, this was about the hiker rescue. There's a satellite tracking device that you can buy called a Spot. There's another one that Garmin makes called an InReach. And so if you are, timber operators and people that are often like hiking way out in the woods or wherever they may be, they don't have to have cell service to be able to get an SOS out. And so those hikers had one and they hit the SOS, which calls the headquarters in Tennessee, and they were spooling up a Navy helicopter to come look for them. And they were outside of Twisp and outside Wenatchee. But they hit it again because they didn't see anybody immediately coming and they got nervous, so they hit it again. But if you hit it twice, it cancels the SOS. Talk about a terrible design flaw, right? So we wrote I called the company and they were like, it's in the instructions. I was like, not good enough, not good enough of an answer. I was like, you know who's not gonna read instructions? Firefighters, believe me, I know. So they, and hikers and whoever else, right?
Well,
But
hikers always bring all their
all the
instructions.
instructions, because reading is the thing that you do whenever you're out hunting and fishing and that kind of
Or
thing.
in a panic.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Well, I'd have hit it 75 times, I know that. Well, I guess 75 would have been okay, but 74 wouldn't, whatever. But so we were able to create this one-page tech tip. So that if there's technical things that we can share and we want to blast it out there, it's a one-page document. So we can do a one-page document on a small, easy-to-understand kind of lesson, or the complex ones where we want people to be able to understand not why someone made a mistake, but what was the context that was created that allowed that mistake to happen, right? So getting to that part of the story is a much more difficult kind of thing to achieve. So small kinds of goals or to these large-scale kinds of goals. And sometimes it requires that you let people pull you up the side of a mountain in a Stokes basket for learning. That's me in the basket. I should do that. And that's me by the tree too, right? It was after a burn. So the learning from unintended outcomes trainings, this is probably the best example of what the Forest Service, the magnitude of the efforts that they put into creating a learning environment. This is a week-long workshop, and anybody that's selected, you have to apply. There's always a waiting list. They do it 2 times a year, 1 week in Tucson and 1 week somewhere else. And it's a full 5 days. The students go through, they're doing a simulation that's the whole time. As they go to classroom instruction and we teach them about these principles, and then they have to practice them. So interviewing victims and survivors, so they're practicing these kinds of things in a simulation. It is profound to be a part of that, watching them learn that process so that they can not just watch it and appreciate it, but that they can produce it for themselves. So we don't have to have what they call me, they usually, whenever I go out on my team, my RLS team, they say there's a learning expert and a dirty firefighter, and they match us up together so that we walk around with different kinds of credibility. But folks in that room, they've already got that. So we're just giving them the rest of the tools to tell the story that they need to tell to get those lessons out there. So, but it doesn't just happen, and here's the part that starts to kind of apply more to you. So that's kind of just skimming the surface of some of the efforts that happen in the Forest Service, and now I'll try to take those and make them applicable to you. So anytime we're trying to learn, right, and we're going to embrace that idea that we're learning from these unintended outcomes, and we'll talk about where the failures come in later, but you have to plan to learn. Again, this isn't something that comes naturally. And a lot of times we are so busy moving forward, particularly in fire, because guess what? There's another fire. There always is another fire. And so, or another natural disaster. With the Forest Service, I mean, I got pulled off of a team and moved to another team last year because all of the rest of my team members had to go to Hurricane Harvey. And so it was like, we're doing all large-scale disasters. And so there's always going to be something coming around the corner, and you get very easily...
It's funny that a lot of knowledge workers and probably a lot of jobs in general, it's called firefighting when stuff is going crazy.
Oh yeah, exactly, exactly.
One fire to the next.
Right,
yeah.
exactly. That metaphor is a very common one. It's funny because we kind of talk about, putting the fires out and, It's weird too, because when you work in fire, it is almost, it's like you're being goaded into using fire metaphors and you don't even mean to. You're like, well, that idea spread like water fire, and you're like, I'm embarrassed for myself. Because you're just like, I just walked into that, you know. But yeah, so, you know, you're busy moving forward, and there's always something that's got your attention, and even if you don't finish this one thing, there's another deadline that's coming up. And so this, you know, you're pushed and you feel this powerful kind of draw to move forward. But the reflection is what's going to enable you to move forward in a measured way, so that you're not just sprinting to a cliff. And that's the hard thing about learning, is that you have to actually plan to do it up front. And sometimes that means putting in resources that we have a hard time convincing administrators that they should give to us to put into these kinds of efforts. In Chattanooga in 2016, this was after the Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg fires, the big wildland urban interface fire that happened. So we had Bastrop and then we had Gatlinburg. They brought me in and we did an AAR, which is an after action review, on all of that year's after action reviews. It was like 200 people in this room, sticky notes all over the walls, and then I had to try and make sense of that for them. But they brought in three learning experts who spoke a little bit of fire and said, okay, now what do we do? How did we learn? You know, and I gave them just a little bit of a diagnostic on the learning environment and what they needed to do to create more of an open learning environment in a lot of ways. And a lot of times that means getting some of the other administrators out of the room and letting people talk about problems openly and that kind of thing. And so putting in the resources ahead of time and knowing that that's something that you want and that you're going to monitor how that progresses and that you're going to try and cultivate that, that's an important part of it. I put an RLS on the RLS. So in the past, we thought that people who were managing ongoing incidents would be able to go out and to complete these reports. So it was on the incident commander and the safety officer and the medical team leader to create these reports, but they have to manage the ongoing incident. So they created the rapid lesson sharing team, call them ground safety teams. So we're the ones who can show up and do the interviews and put together a report. And so it takes it off of their plates. And we've only been doing it for about 4 years. And in about the second year, because I'm always going to be a researcher. Remember, happy classroom teacher. So I'm always thinking about the process, about what we're doing. And so now we're doing an RLS on the RLS teams. I got an invitation right before I came in here to go to the risk management team meeting in Tucson to talk about, are we going to create a guide for how we do this? Because we've learned a lot of things that work and a lot of things that don't work through being out in the field. And so if we're going to get other people to buy into this, we need to share those. So it's very reflective and introspective. The whole time we're looking for ways that we might be able to improve on what we're doing. But the hard part is not to just do this. That's a good idea, and then you move forward. Because then it's just, it goes away. And so we have to capture it somehow, start talking about those lessons. So that's the other part of it is firefighters are great, Forest Service is great at getting into groups of 8 people and bitching about ideas and then going, yeah, and then we leave and we don't fix it. We just kind of stay at this level. They call it communication verga. It's like there's like heavy weighted pressure above it, and that's just where it stops. Or people just perceive that the next step's going to be too hard and you don't do anything. So we have to get over that hurdle, and that requires planning to learn. You also have to provide a space for both individual and group sense making. And when I say this, I mean, you're probably familiar with the term sense making, but not everyone realizes that it has to happen individually. So people experience incidents in very different ways. And a lot of times we don't always know quite what we experience. And that's going to come into play with the group sense making. So do you know what these are? Can you tell?
Axe heads.
Close, yeah, splitting wedges, yeah, right? So you would, use them to, if you're going to, take down different trees, split things, yes, split them. So whenever I was about 5 years old, I was standing on the front porch and my brother handed me one of those, and it was too heavy, clearly, and I dropped it and cut my toe open and had to get stitches on my toe. And I always, I'm a little sister, and, of course I know that my brother loves me, but he's also the one that's like, I bet you can't jump your bike over that ravine, right? And then I'm always like, I will probably get hurt at some point. So I was home, I don't know, let's say 20 years later, 25, 30 years later, And I was talking to my family and I was like, yeah, I can't believe that you were like, I was telling my dad, I was like, I can't believe you just like let me stand out there on the porch and nobody thought that that should be somewhere else. And I can't believe Ben just like handed it to me. And he was like, you pulled that off of a trash can lid. He wasn't even out there. And I was like, oh, for 30 years I thought that, I developed like a whole narrative around how I thought that he was just a little less than protective of me. And it was over something that didn't even occur. So whenever we actually go in and do these investigations, these learning reviews, we can start to get that information that people experience that they don't talk about to the surface. And that's where it comes into group sense making. So we also, this stands for Facilitated Group Dialogue. It's one of the tools that we teach the students in the Learning from Unintended Outcomes workshop. So what we try and do is facilitate group dialogue. And it sounds a lot easier than it is because sometimes people are sitting there and they're blaming each other for very terrible things that have happened. And it's also difficult to get people to talk because they don't know that the information that they're sitting on is important. So that's where we say we have to kind of rescue the tacit knowledge. What do you know that you assume everybody else knows or that you don't bring to the surface so that we can actually understand a situation from more of a holistic perspective? Because people, particularly who've experienced an emergency, they only see what they can see at the point where they are, right? And they don't know what else is going on in the fire. They don't know what's going on with the helicopter. They've only got bits and pieces of information and they're having to make decisions about it. But they also can't then empathize with other people on the fire because they don't know what that person is experiencing. So it's something as easy as we pull out a timeline. Well, I tell them to draw me a timeline. Everybody has to draw their timeline by themselves. And some people start the morning of. Some people start last fire season, right? The timeline is really flexible and the punctuation of the timeline can change. Some people will just talk about the 30 minutes surrounding the helicopter crash, right? So whenever you get people who are involved in the incident to draw that timeline, you start to see discrepancies that people are assuming that, they're like, well, it was around noon. They're like, it was 2 p.m. And sometimes you have logs through dispatch, but sometimes you don't. So you start to get people to understand one another's decision making and to develop that rich context by giving them a tool like that to learn. Another important part of learning is to tolerate uncertainty. This is one of the hardest ones because a lot of times we want to know what we're going to get out of it before we commit to it. That goes back to trying to get people, particularly administrators, on board with supporting your efforts. They want to know what you're going to get out of it, but you can't necessarily know that from the beginning or it wouldn't be learning, right? It would just be done. So, and you wouldn't have to go through the process. And so this whole thing means you have to kind of maybe go down a dead-end road to find out it's a dead-end road, but that you still see that there was worth in that. And that's a hard thing to get people a lot of times to buy into when they're thinking about the bottom line. But it's also, this isn't an investigation, so one of the examples of a pretty big failure that I was a part of, we'll say failure this time, and that's only because the learning didn't get to go anywhere. I went on an FLA in Oklahoma and there was a fatality. It was a motor grader operator who was also fighting fires. He was a volunteer firefighter but had no training, no personal protective equipment, made some less than informed decisions and got killed as a result of it. And that was a really, really tough one to write for me, partly because he fell into a weird area because he wasn't a federal employee, so we couldn't get the resources for him and his family or the other people on his crew that were grieving and probably needed some support. So that was hard. But then, and also attending a funeral of somebody that you've never met and having the family, talk to you about those kinds of things. There's a lot of it that was difficult. But the worst part is that one person right now is standing in the way of that whole report and all of that learning to go out because it just he didn't get to push his political agenda through. And that means all of the rest of the learning that could have taken place is going to kind of fall away. That's probably the most frustrating of the experiences that I've had right now is when, there's always going to be people, right, that are being pulled in multiple directions and mostly, or a lot of times, conflicting directions. And so getting all of those people on board to embrace this type of thing is tough to do. But he wanted us to be pointing a finger and say, who screwed up? And that's the opposite of the learning review. And I think that he didn't understand that what we were going to go do was not going to be this sharpened failure. Who are we going to fire or hang out to dry? We're saying, oh, well, you need to start prioritizing these kinds of things and, inviting him to learn about certain things that he was doing they didn't want to come to terms with. So that's a hard thing to shed, is looking for blame. That's a very natural thing. Organizations where we do it we're set up to do it because it's much more difficult to make those systemic changes than it is to find an individual. And plus, it's so much easier just to wash your hands of it because you can say this one employee screwed up. Or that one thing that happened, that doesn't really represent us, right? There's different ways that organizations do it based on an individual or the group or a particular thing that happened, or by saying that, nope, I'm sorry, you on the outside, you have your opinions, but we have the knowledge. Organizations can escape blame in a lot of different ways. But this one is a particularly difficult one because it remedies the problem for you. It's done. We found the individual who screwed up, but that's not going to be what leads to learning. And then these other techniques, I kind of talked about tacit knowledge. This is organizational learning and sense making, and it really is focused on kind of a communication angle. The idea that there's a ton of different things happening, and you can think about when I say ton of different things happening, I'm talking about you get to work, you've already had, you know, a morning of traffic and all these kinds of things. You get there and you're trying to make a decision about how to get through your inbox, or is it that you need to work on this other project, or how are you going to do all these things? There's 1,000 different things you can pay attention to, not to mention your conference calls and the group meetings that you have to have and all those things, right? So you've got a lot of things that are happening. And so you have to, you know, certain kinds of things are going to catch your attention because they have a higher priority. You've been told to do them by someone in authority. You think that the consequences of not getting done will be bad, so your attention gets narrowed onto certain kinds of things. And then we name them within organizations. We say something is a priority or an opportunity or something is a failure. We name something. And then that, however we name it, if we say that this was a tragedy, then we are associating all this negative kind of connotations with it, and that's how we're going to act it out in the world. We'll reflect on it, we will call it a tragedy, then we consider it tragic after that. So this naming process is very important, and that's something that we were talking about, Heather and I, earlier. Within the Forest Service, there can be serious investigations, and those are usually legal, and they are looking for kind of from an insurance perspective, who's messed up and who's going to pay for this, that kind of thing. We don't use investigation. I've said it a couple of times here just because it works with different audiences. But really, these learning reviews, we kind of are careful with each other when we're doing it in the field, because if you say investigation, that pulls with it all of the culture that we don't want to continue to cultivate. And so language is a pretty important part of how we're doing it, and it changes how we act.
Could you go through those again one more time?
The whole thing?
No.
Well, sure.
Back to slide one.
Yeah.
Flux and sifting.
Yes. So flux has to do with any potential thing that is going on within an organization at a particular time. And that, you know, the idea that we say we go to an organization, it's like a container, like you walk into it and all of a sudden you're just a worker, is ridiculous, right? Because you take your home stuff into work too. The container metaphor for organizations is dangerous, but that's a different lecture. But this is, you know, the idea that when you get there, there's already a lot of things that are happening in your own mind, individual walking around with all your stuff, but then there's all the work stuff. And that can also be in the form of all the emotional kinds of things, water cooler conversations about politics you don't want to discuss, right. Or all of the actual tasks that you have to be on, the future planning, the woman down the hall who's having a shower, whatever it is, right? There's all of those kinds of things.
Weather,
and then,
holidays are going on, all that.
Everything, all that kind of stuff. Memos that get kind of sorted at you, professional development opportunities, all these kinds of things. It's all stuff. But somehow, based on perception and based on different kinds of things, we narrow that. And so you kind of sift. Some of it's going to, stay in your view, and some of it's going to fall from your view. And so, things that influence how things are going to sift can be things like your perception of how important something is. That's going to definitely bring it to the surface. When we talk about these things, when it's based on perception, we say proximity. What's laying on your desk? What's right in front of your desk? That thing right there, that's probably visually going to cue you in to take care of it. You do that, though, right? Whenever, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but if I know I need to get something done in the morning, I'll put it on my keyboard, right? Because it's, that you're going to have to, move it, So you are tricking yourself into, you're artificially sifting in that way because you know that you want to prioritize it. And so, but there are other things, right? If your boss tells you this is something you need to do, that's going to rise to the surface. So there's a lot of factors that sift any of the potential things we could be paying attention to. This part right here where we go through naming, this is where we take a phenomena in the world that has no kind of essence of its own, and with the power of language, we make it be something. We make it a priority or a threat or a consequence or an outcome or an opportunity, right? All of this language that has really, they have really powerful frames to invite us to think of it in a certain way. And that's going to lead us to act in a certain way. So if we think that something, a lot of times organizations face crises, but they have to like flip it and turn it into an opportunity if they're going to survive those kinds of things. Toyota did it whenever they shut down production when they had the sticky pedal. Remember that? Shut down for like 2 weeks, and people were like, they're just so forward thinking, right? Like, okay, they did have a crisis, but then how they took care of it, positioned, and this is always the advantage that organizations can pull into if they can, manage their crises in the right way. But that has to do with naming something in a way that allows them the space to see it as an opportunity, not just as a failure. Better? Clear?
Or encoding.
Enacting?
Enacting.
Yeah.
So what actions flow out of those?
Exactly.
You act in your frame, you act out the role.
Yep,
that
exactly.
you decided to
Mhm.
put on.
That we take actions based on how we have gone through the first 3 parts of that cycle. Yeah, and the reason that they have enacting instead of just acting or taking action is because it really is dependent on the naming cycle. Because it's not a natural thing. It wouldn't just everybody does this. You've created it, now you're going to enact it. You're going to put forth, you're going to make that thing that you called it a thing into what you're doing all the time.
I really like that quote on one of the web pages that you had up earlier that was like, we will know we've learned something when we act differently.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's another big question within organizational learning is how do we know when we learned? A lot of times that has to do with actually behaving different in the world. And we often think that we have to change our attitudes, beliefs, values, the way we think, our cognition, before we actually change our behavior in the world. That's classic, right? That's how we think it always works. There are certain situations where it doesn't, like yoga, right? Have you ever done yoga?
Yeah.
Have you done yoga once? Anybody that just did it once, you're like, no. Like you go do it and you're like, no, this doesn't do anything. It's because it's a practice and you have to do it and then eventually you buy into it. Or if you've been in the military doesn't really care too much that you know how to make a bed properly. Sometimes you're not getting a bed because you're sleeping in a tent. So that is not the process. The process is becoming disciplined by doing this action. So sometimes we do the action in order to believe something, but a lot of organizational learning we would say has to function in any other way. So you're going to have to buy into the idea and then you start to act it out in the world. Do I?
Just wax on, wax off. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. You're not going to know this why you're doing the blocks, and then you're going to actually figure it out one day. This one I didn't write the whole thing on the slide. It says ADV, naivete. It means advantageous naivete. It's my secret weapon when it comes to organizational learning. And part of it is because I am in the middle, so I'm an academic to the firefighters, and I'm a firefighter to the academics, so you're never enough in one of those categories for anyone. So super uncomfortable, but also a great opportunity, because I'm kind of a day walker, so I like being in that area. But the good news is that I can walk into incident command posts and ask questions, and I ask every question, because I don't make any assumptions, because I don't know anything. Well, I know some things, but not all the things. And so I'll walk in with my dirty firefighter and I'll say, why are they doing it like that? Why do you do it like that? And he's like, well, and then he'll look at the incident commander, he's like, wait, why do we do it like that? Right? And so I ask the questions that would be probably, it would be uncomfortable for people who are really seasoned to ask. This is another thing for organizational learning that you can use too, is to, sometimes it means bringing in somebody from the outside. Depending on how big your problems are and how chronic they are, it means bringing in someone who can say, why has it happened that way, right? It's classic kind of ethnographer stuff. I think you mentioned something about anthropology earlier, or somebody was. I don't know, you were sitting on the couch over there. I heard somebody say anthropology. Classic, methods, ethnography, getting out there and living it and doing those kinds of things. This is the best tool that I have developed, because whenever I sit down to look at my notes, to write a report, to have enough detail to write a compelling story, so that people read it and they can get caught up in it and they can see how people are making decisions, it means that I took every piece of information. My notes are a holy mess because I'm writing super fast in the field, and I go home, I write every day that I'm out in the field, and I try and make sense of what I'm doing as I go so that I can ask questions of the participants, usually before I leave the field. So that's the number one thing is you can't be too knowledgeable about what's going on because you make assumptions about what other people know. And so bringing in green, kind of fresh eyes is important, can be important. So if safety or success as you define it, whatever you would define success for us, it's being safe. You might think it's saving all the trees, and although we do want to save the trees, it's firefighter and civilian safety. That's what we care about. And if we keep that as the priority, everything else can fall into it. And when that gets out of the priority is when we make the kinds of failures that are really long lasting. So there were no structures up there. Why did we put in 2 repellers to fight to save rocks? Like screek and burn, why are we fighting it? Plus we're gonna go put a prescribed burn down there next year. Why are we fighting that fire? When we don't prioritize safety and we think of things like our image, we don't want there to be mega fires in the news for so long because people are like, why aren't they just putting the wet stuff on the red stuff and putting that fire out, right? It makes it look bad. So we put them out quickly, but that's not always the main thing. So safety has to be the number one priority for us, at least. So there's a different way that you can define it. Hopefully your organizations are pretty safe too. But if safety isn't the number one thing that you would judge your success on, what would it be? Is it employee health and wellness? Is it creating creative solutions to the most persistent problems that face us? What is it? What is your version of that? But if we are going to do this, then the map, right? So I've got the map on the hood of the truck there. That's a very classic move too, is that we always pull the maps out, not digital maps, hardcore maps, and we put them out on the truck the hood of the truck. So if we're gonna get there, it involves creating a just culture. People need to trust that they share lessons without being punished, and we need to capture and share those stories. And for us, those stories are gonna be in these learning tools, rapid lesson sharing, facilitated learning analysis, whatever it might be. But that could be different for your organization too. I don't have this mistaken idea that you're going to do these kinds of learning reviews, but there is an ethos to what we're doing here that you can do, and whatever you produce can be different. So carefully review events and create high quality learning tools. The point of this is to say, people are going to make sense of an event or a failure, whatever you want to call it. They're going to make sense of that. And either what can be kind of circulated surrounding the event is the product of a thoughtful process where you ask people questions and you learn what was going on, or it's the rumor mill. And that doesn't usually produce the best learning, and it doesn't have a lot of intent. So you can do this intentionally. It doesn't matter if you're writing reports or you're just sharing what you've done. You can do all of this just verbally. That's how most of the after action reviews or when I used to work in the VA, the M&Ms, Morbidity and Mortality Conferences on Mondays, M&Ms on Mondays. We would just go in and learn like what happened the last week, what went wrong, what did we want to happen, and how can we change those things. So it was just a meeting that we did. But the whole point was that we had to slow down in order to do that. So an after action review, SWOT, that's a really familiar tool, right? So it's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's a common old school one. The M&Ms, FLAs, RLSs, the whole thing is that you have to go slow to go fast. I know that's a little bit overused, but for us that means if we don't slow things down to learn from them in an intentional and reflective way, we will not be able to go fast in the future. This is planning, right? Learning can be considered a type of planning. If you're not embracing the lessons that are offered to you through an incident, then you don't have the chance to make those changes, and so you're not going to be able to go fast later. If you want to change the culture, change the story. And that's the hardest sell for the firefighters. That's also what I come in. So whenever they bring me in, I'm there as a narrative expert and I teach people about storytelling. And I had a whole bunch of storytelling in this presentation. I was like, Heather's just gonna have to invite me back. Because there's no way I can tell you all this. I want you to know all this, but I can't tell you all this right now. But
We're waiting to narrative and storytelling, so that would be great to hear that. Later on, yeah.
Oh, hey, I would absolutely love to do it. And that is, so for the workshops, that's probably 3 hours of what I teach. Is just, and I'm talking a little bit about it, but not the whole thing today. But I'd be glad to talk about it at a different time. But, this idea that if we're going to change the culture, we're going to get people to openly embrace learning from things that go wrong, the story about who we are and what we do and all that kind of stuff also has to change. And so the process of learning, when you go and engage people who have been involved in some kind of unintended outcome, you have those sense-making opportunities. those people are going to learn the most. But that doesn't have to stop there. The products that we produce, whatever it might be, could be a memo, could be a full story, could be any of those kinds of things. Those products, with the process, create the potential to change the culture. We have a little graphic that we use. You know, the people who's going to learn. What is the likelihood of learning when a helicopter goes down or something like that? Well, the people who were there, they're going to learn a lot because they, the guy who tried to carry the motor grader operator in Oklahoma, the guy that tried to get him out of the field, even though he was pretty far gone, he tried to get him out of that field, and he was a shaken man at the end of that, and he never wore PPE. I mean, they were in cowboy hats and jeans and button-up shirts with pearlized buttons. They did not have PPE. And he was burnt pretty badly inside of the closed motor grader, not because of direct fire, but because of heat, from radiant heat. And so he saw some guys that were also working at the shop, and he was like, "Where's your PPE?" Like, he saw his friend pretty much die in the field. They got into the ambulance, but they didn't make it down the road. He will wear his PPE now. That guy is not going to not get his PPE on. And the coworkers, people that are watching these people go through the cycles of having to deal with grief and all these questions that come into their own job, those folks are going to learn. Interestingly, friends, family, and acquaintances, because everybody goes home and tells, you know, all the people around them what these incidents have been. Yeah, so you know how that can go. People who do similar kinds of work, so if you have another motor grader operator out there or somebody like that, or Firefighter X, that's the learner that's co-located. So somebody who's never been a part of this process, doesn't know these people, how it is that we can write a document that will help that person learn. So we're interested in spread in fire. We're interested, see?
Yep.
Can't, it's just impossible. We are interested in spread, in all kinds of spread. So I want to tell you a really, really fast story, and I know that my time is running out. So we may not get to do the fun exercise at the end, but I will come back and we'll do fun exercises at a different time. So this was a picture of Dolly and Smokey after the Gatlinburg fires, because outside of Gatlinburg, Dolly opened up all of Dollywood to Forest Service employees and said, anybody that needs to stay here can. She is fantastic. She's a national treasure. Before this, I would have been like, yeah, whatever, Dolly. But after that, it was just like, man, that woman has heart and generosity. But that's what we saw pretty much all over the South. And it was even to the point where we, you know, I would go into Five Guys Burgers and people would try and put money in the pocket of my Nomex, you know, and I was like, nope, can't do that. We're on a per diem, plus that's a big conflict of interest. So we wrote a document called Managing Aggressive Kindness, which I think it was good because people would they were getting into some situations where people would fight each other to get to buy our lunches. We're like, no, stop, you know, and if we are perceived as taking money, it looks like we might, you know, fight fire at your house, but not your house. It is a really big problem. And we want people to be thankful, but not to try and give us money. And plus, then, you know, you say, like, people, you know, you can give if you want to give, but then people just go in and clean out their closets and they're donating, like, dirty prom dresses. You're like, we don't need that stuff. Like, so you have to help people to give in a way that helps you. And so we wrote a document. It was a real quick RLS on how to help people help you in a way that you need it. So fast forward, last year, maybe you remember hearing about, there was a fish and wildlife refuge that was taken over by the militia, the Bundys that are out of Arizona. So I got called to do a learning review of the militia takeover. I interviewed everybody, not the militia. They're, at that time, one of them was in jail, but I don't want to talk about that. But I interviewed the FBI, law enforcement.
By the way, so
Do what?
you're good on time.
Oh, okay, good. All right. Well, if you're telling me that because I'm talking fast, this is really just me. I'm sure, isn't it? He's like, yes. I think it might have been Jonathan that said that listening to me is like trying to take a drink out of a fire hose. And so I just have so much you need to know. But anyway, so I did the Malheur Learning Review. That one was tough because all of the employees had been evacuated into Portland because they were getting death threats from the militia and that kind of thing. So we went in and we learned a lot about what we need to do to try and protect employee health and wellness during an event like that. Talk about incident within an incident kind of situation. So they had the same problem though because the militia tore up everything. They used heavy machinery and they actually messed up burial grounds and they did a lot of damage, yeah, and a lot of damage to the facilities too. But you know, we're gonna open the refuge back up, and so the Girl Scouts are there like, we're here to help. We're like, we need heavy excavating machinery. Like, we can't do anything with the Girl Scouts, you know? And so they're like, oh, well, thank you. But, you know, and you don't want never turn away a Girl Scout that's willing to help you, because you never know who you're going to need in the future. And plus, they need to give. They're working on badges, and they need to give, right? And plus, it's in the South, it's the sticky South. I'm from the sticky South, so I can say that. There's a need to give. And so if you tell people that, no, we can't use your help, it's a problem. And so we have to figure out how to do that. So there was a maintenance worker at the Malheur, at the Fish and Wildlife Refuge. He was probably 19 years old. And the second day that I was there, we had been talking about, volunteering opportunities. And he came out and he was like, hey, Rebecca, look at this. And he puts Managing Aggressive Kindness, the report I written a year before. And he's like, check this one. And I was like, first of all, it's really well written. And second of all, wow, that is interesting. He's like, yeah, I read it because it was a weird title. And I was like, my work here is done. Like, I was like, but that was a moment where I was like, does organizational learning efforts work? Yes. Did organizational learning efforts work in Oklahoma? Probably for the people that were there on the ground and for our team, and how many times we've talked about that story. But the Managing Aggressive Kindness situation showed me that it's happening through our the mechanisms we have in place, like through the website and that kind of thing. So that can be a really good situation. However, the Malheur report got tied up with the FBI, because by going in and saying, okay, I interviewed the tech people, and I was like, okay, what do we need to do? They're like, well, don't do this, and here's what we need to do, get this kind of camera. We were like reverse engineering another militia takeover. And we were like, oops, right? Because what do we learn? What do we need to tell other people? Well, here's what we learned. And so the militia's like, yep, okay, here's what we'll avoid, and here's what we will take from that. So accidentally reverse engineered another militia takeover. So that one is caught up for good reason, but there's still gonna be things that we can learn from it, like the hospital liaison, the family liaisons, those kinds of things that people put into place that made it a lot less damaging to the employees. Those are the kinds of things we can still share. So I'm not completely, it's not a complete loss, but we would call it a watch out situation, because there seems to be a lot of learning that it can be underneath the surface there, but then there are these other kinds of things that can come in and kind of block how that goes. And as Heather and I were talking about earlier, when those kinds of things happen, it can really cause setbacks for how organizations buy into the process. So failed efforts at learning can tank the learning process in the future, or even people that speak the language that we're talking about tonight, right? When people hear innovative and learning techniques and those kinds of things, they can just be like, nope, heard that before, it didn't work. So having to clean the kitchen before you can cook is always a harder chore, but knowing what has come before you so that you can kind of overcome it, or embrace it and put it in and recognize where the hurdle is and figure out a way to get over the hurdle. Watch out situations. Okay, you might be skeptical. You should be. I expect a room full of people here to be very skeptical. So here's some of the skepticism that I encounter in the field. So we don't need stories and reports. People are like, I just need bullet points, or just give me a timeline. I'm like, well, really, when you do bullet points and timeline, you're just doing kind of an anemic story, right? You've just given us the bones, but not the meat. So we're gonna like pull our own conclusions together, which again, this can be through a thoughtful process where you are asking people who are involved what happened, what did you learn, those kinds of things, and you're giving a constructed story through the voices of the participants, or you can leave it up to the rumor mill. But the idea is when people think they're not putting stories in there, they usually mean we don't want bad stories. Nobody does, right? You want to read a compelling narrative, so that's the thing that we have to work on doing. That could be a different workshop too.
So these are voices.
Yeah, the
voices
skeptics.
trying to speak against.
Yes, the skeptic voices, they say, we don't need no stinking stories, right? Because people are like, they've written reports, and the reports are bullet points or timelines, and they don't want to read about, what someone looked like, or the fact that the tanker driver was over 300 pounds, right? At some point, the details are just too much, right? But sometimes it's exactly the story. P.S. They cut out a place from the bottom of the mountain up to where he was, because they weren't going to be able to get him out through the rappelling gear that they had. So in that situation, if you're going to learn from that, it's that you can continue to work on one plan, but you better send all of the rest of the resources to the bottom of the mountain. There's an equivalent, I'm sure, in your organization to that, right? So don't just trust your one method. Try and keep all of these things coming. And they still were going to bring in the helicopters after that too. So yeah, these are the pieces of skepticism. And I hear that a lot. We don't need stories, but we just need better stories. Experience is the only real teacher. I hope not. We hope not to have to experience things firsthand. The whole idea of the story is that it's the reason it's a powerful form of discourse is because it invites you to see yourself in it. Like, would I have made that same decision? And when you're all judgy as the reader, you're like, man, I can't believe you did that, right? Like, you know, or the best ones are the ones where you're like, oh man, I would have done that same thing, right? If you write a report, if you write one of these in such a way where you're like, that person was just so silly, I can never imagine why somebody would do that, then you've probably failed at the narrative, because that's not a complex narrative, not the lived reality of someone. So if you write it and they're like, oh, I would have done that, then you've caught them, right? Then it has a chance to kind of be this simulator ride where people are reading it and they're kind of trying it on and figuring out if it represents them and what would they have done. Those stories are the way that we make a lot of decisions in our lives. We want to think all the time that what we do is we walk around and we're making logical, rational decisions based on statistical analysis and good quality research data. But a lot of times it's a story of, oh man, I don't want to do what Nana did, or I better do the, you know, like you're thinking of stories to make a lot of your judgments. And so we hope that experience is not the only teacher. And then the idea that we need to find truth, not write a story. So people have that idea, like the connotation of lying, or that it's made up or it's fake or something like that. Yeah, that you're looking for one explanation. But that goes back to the whole idea of an investigation and figuring out root cause. What was the number one thing that went wrong? What went wrong? So that's what that also kind of speaks to. So can everybody see this podium okay? I think you can, right? You can see it. Is it Jamie, right? You can see it okay? Okay, so everyone in here, I know that you're very good people, but you kind of lie just a little bit. Because what you can see on this podium is the limited perspective from where you're sitting, right? You can't see that I carved my initials into the back of it. I didn't do that, don't worry, I didn't do that. But you can see it if I did, right? You can't see my mug that says NAFRI on it. You can't see some of these kinds of things. You said you could see it, but you can only see part of it from where you're sitting. And that's always, I do this because it's an obnoxious example. Everyone feels a little bit violated by me because I'm like, you're kind of lying. But this is something you can take this with you because it always makes a difference. People experience these events in those ways too. And so when you say you're going to get one truth, all you mean is you're going to get the portion of the story usually that services your interest. You're going to stop at the one that's plausible, that gets you out of trouble, and that's it. But that's not the whole experience. No one that's there is qualified to do that. That's why we do what we call, it's creative nonfiction. So I'm going to go out, I'm going to interview a whole bunch of people, and I'm going to weave together a story that encompasses and pulls together those experiences, but it's no one person's experience. We don't do an interview with one person and say that that represents everyone's experiences. We have to interview a lot of people and pull it all together. Usually the reports have the narrative events, background if they need it, narrative events, and then a lessons learned section. And that's from the voices of the participants. So we can come in and we're like, well, here's the lesson you should have learned. But that's really not what we want to do. Plus it gets us into this other area where we'd be responsible for making recommendations. And that's also a little bit more of a dangerous ground. So when we just go in and we say, my job is to represent the unique subjective experience of the people who lived through this in their voices as best I can, that means I'm just a kind of a conduit. And it means I'm not going to have to go in with all the answers as the learning expert. So if they're so important, ooh, hey, let's go back here. Yeah, they are important. So a few functions of storytelling, and it is creative nonfiction. We talked about it's a free simulator ride. They also tell us who we are. So when it comes to organizational learning, if we are resilient, it's because we've talked ourselves into being that way. A former professor of mine interviewed people who had survived Hurricane Katrina, and there was a family, and there was about 8 people living in one hotel room. And she interviewed them, or I think she interviewed the dad. So, well, how's everything going? He's like, we're good, we're doing fine. She's like, you're not fine. You're in a hotel room, and there's 8 of you in here, right? But he said something like, no, it's because we're the Coxes, whatever his name was. It was like, this is what we do. We are resilient. But it really wasn't a reflection of all of what was going on. It was a personal kind of thing. But it was talking their way into it, right? That's not how we act. We act like this. So the language associated with being resilient and embracing that as a communication tool. Our stories tell us who we are and the kind of work that we get done. And another, just one other quote here, one person's story is another's rationalization. So whenever you're faced with making a decision, you sift through your Rolodex of stories, and that's what we're trying to increase the quality of those. You've heard slides and those kinds of things. We're saying that it comes in story form, or that we're capturing the stories in order to do that. Okay, I think.
Can you go over that one a little bit more? I didn't catch that one.
One person's story is another's rationalization. So the idea is that whenever you're having to rationalize what it is that you're going to do at a decision point, should I do this? Should I do this? Is it gonna be that bad if I just need to kind of take off that one edge of the berm and it won't be that bad? Well, wait a minute. I do remember reading that one RLS, right? So if you're faced with a decision, you're gonna pull those stories in to make your own decisions. And that's what we want to happen. It's natural function whenever you're making decisions, but we don't always kind of buy into that.
So it's not the negative form of rationalization, it's the
Yeah,
positive.
No,
It's a
yeah,
good
it's
thing.
like, okay,
Oh,
yep,
yeah.
it's, you're justifying how you're gonna make your next move and you're rationalizing it to yourself because a lot of things that are out there don't seem very rational, but you have to do what I call mental gymnastics a lot of times. You're like, should I do this or this? So you're doing all that work in order to make a decision, and the stories are gonna function heavily into that. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, so I'm just reiterating the point that rationalization in this usage is a good thing.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
you're using a good story as basis of the
Mhm.
decision,
sure.
rather than just your own judgment.
Yeah,
It may or
well,
may
and,
not have
and
any
here,
context to it.
this is a quote that's taken from an analysis, a narrative analysis on a support group. And like, why would people go to a support group, right? If you're an alcoholic, why are you going to a group of people who are not winning at the same thing you're failing in?
This is a good question.
Right. So the idea is, so this is not necessarily, I wouldn't say this is valence. Don't think of this as positive or negative, just this is a natural process. Is that whenever I hear, I go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, or whatever it is, anonymous meeting, and I'm listening to people and how they're dealing with the world, their story, whenever I go out into the real world and I'm faced with those kinds of decisions, I've got their stories as options to inform my decision making. And so this isn't necessarily to say that it's a rational thing, or excuse me, maybe I should use a different, that it's a smart thing, or that it's gonna lead to better outcomes, but it is a lot of times what we're just left with whenever we are gonna make those decisions. We're gonna pull in as many stories as we can. And we do this more so than we think, because we think we just walk around like logical machines and we're just making we get consumer reports and like we just have all these things in our minds and we are just making those mechanistic decisions. But really it's a lifetime of experiences where you've watched people suffer and succeed, and you're trying to pull those into the moment because they're packaged up in those nice stories and they kind of resonate with us. So how can this be modified? And this will be kind of where I finish up for us tonight. So with the FLA, so what I did on this side was tell you kind of what this looks like for us in the FLA process, that big learning analysis process. So we learn from events or near misses. People say near misses when they really mean near hits most of the time. Like it was a near miss because the distance was small between it, but usually we think of it in the wrong way. Let that sink in. Later tonight you go, oh yeah, I see what you're doing right there. It's just a language thing that we do, but that's what we learn from a lot of times. Fatalities too. I mean, we learn all kinds of things. On the ground this year, whenever I was in Washington, I would show people pictures of the scree, the rocks where the hikers were, and they're like, ooh, that's Andy Palmer territory. Andy Palmer was a firefighter who was killed because they called off the short haul helicopter because they thought they had another way of rescuing him, and he had a compound fracture and died. And so that language, like the whole narrative of who he was and the lesson associated with keep it all coming in an emergency, like don't worry that it cost $30,000 to launch that aircraft, launch it. Right? No one's gonna say that cost a lot of money later. So all of those kinds of things we can learn from them. The length of time, we can be in the field 5 to 10 days. I was on the ground 36 days doing a whole bunch of different ones, or it can be shorter than that. The assurances, this is the hard one. Like, how do you know that you're not going to be, like, it cannot be a punitive process for us. That's through a delegation of authority. State forester, a line officer, you have to have all these people who are like, even if you find that somebody did something wrong, we will not hold them responsible. You know what kind of, think of this 30 years ago. I mean, it's hard to get people to buy into it now. We say we're doing it like we're succeeding around every corner, but people just don't, right? They're like, I don't believe you, right? We have to work to make this happen, and the delegation of authority helps us with that. We're like, they promised they will not come at you. If there's illegal activity, if somebody's flying a helicopter drunk, then we're not doing a learning analysis because the learning kind of ends at that moment. So it's better for certain kinds of things than it is for others. Go ahead.
And they buy into that? We're not gonna.
The delegation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand the delegation authority, but I'm trying to come to grips with the concept of in such a regimented incident response type organization that there's this acceptance of if we discover that Fred or Sally is at fault, we're not gonna turn this into a punitive. They buy into that?
That's the delegation of authority, that signed letter that says we will not do it.
You
It's their
actually did it in
protection.
writing.
Oh yeah, no, that's the very first day of the FLA process says who is going to be involved in the actual learning review, what, how much money can be spent on the learning review, how many people you can bring in, anything like that. It has to be all laid out. All team members have to sign
And if
it.
you've got 7 layers of management, all 7 layers sign it?
Everybody.
Wow.
That's why. But see, this is the Forest Service in so many ways. They function, I think, a lot of time like you see Smokey Bear, but this whole wildland Forest Service stuff is very hidden from John and Jane Q Citizen. And this dedication to learning is off the radar completely. It baffles me occasionally that they get all those layers, that they bring me in. They're like, we'll pay you. And then sometimes, this is when I knew that I was a real, like, in the middle one. They're like, we don't know really what you do, Fox, because you can say comm and rhetoric and organizational learning. They're like, meh, 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 but they'll say, we want you in the room. Because then I'll say something and they'll go, oh, that, And so getting them to take a chance on me and getting them to take a chance on this whole process is, it really is a feat. And it's, the credit is to the people who've come before me who have laid it all out. And talking about it more like this, openly in the public, and saying that these things happen, solidifies that we can openly talk about the problems. So I guess that's all right there. Oh wait, there was one more. Will I be able to pull it back up?
I hope so. I mean, there's,
What, was it on a
I
timer?
don't know why.
Oh, could be that my computer died. Oh, hey, that's okay. There was going to be an activity, which we won't do, and then I was going to give you like my email address and stuff, but I can do that offline or through
Well,
the
if you have your
materials.
power cord, you can plug it in.
How long does
It's-
the activity take?
Probably, I'm going to say 15 to 20 minutes, but I can always do it a different night. I'd be glad to do that. Really,
When she comes back, can we just like start way earlier? Yeah.
it's just a storytelling activity. It's really not got, any mojo of its own, but it just gives people an opportunity to remember that we're all pretty good natural storytellers. And what's scary a lot of times is writing, but then we can learn how to do that too. So that would have been your prize for the night, but instead, knowledge is your prize for the night. But yeah, questions, go ahead.
Thanks for this perspective. This is useful, and
I'm
it's
so
going to take
glad.
a few days to think about it.
Yeah.
I understand. I think the process, a very disciplined process of creating the reports and
Yeah.
the stories and all this useful scenario. I don't understand how the existence of these good stories manifest itself in the organizational change. Somebody, I don't think the firefighters are out there going to the library, pulling.
Right, so this is the part that,
So I don't get that second half.
yeah, so and it's always the challenge, and we're working to try and measure spread to see if we're assessing our learning as we're doing it. And part of the reason I tell you the story about managing aggressive kindness is because it surprised me that this 19-year-old, why would he be motivated to read any of these lessons? But what has happened is that different forest supervisors, forest management officers and things like that, they'll pick 1 or 2 from the week and they'll use them for like their own kind of small case studies. So if you're gonna have a meeting and we don't wanna rehash why everyone should make sure that you drink enough water and they'll pull out one of these scenarios and they use it as a discussion point. So we kind of are forcing them to get it out there. That's what the other thing is that I took a whole bunch of them with me. I did a tree strike last year, a couple of different ones, and I would just take them in the rig, and whenever I would go, and I would use it as a tool to say, here's what we're gonna do about this incident, and here's the kind of thing I would produce. People look at it like, oh, that's fine, because it kind of makes it to where they're not defensive that we're doing this investigation.
It's not making stuff up.
Exactly, right? They're like, oh, okay, and plus, we learned how very early that there's pockets of that good tacit knowledge underneath the surface, and that people are smart. They're doing good things, they just don't know to share it. So we figure out what is innovative about their approach, and we pull it forward. And now they get to kind of be the champions of the knowledge that gets shared. And when you tell someone, wow, that thing that you're doing that no one else in the Forest Service is doing is fabulous. And we're the ones that get to see it. They don't know that, they think it's common sense, but no one, not very common. So we have to, kind of trump that stuff up. Go ahead.
as you were talking there, I was reminded of Checklist Manifesto, and there's like, a lot of parallels to it,
Yeah.
a lot of divergences from it, and in some ways they probably are perfect like companions. But I was just wondering, sort of like in the world of the Forest Service, like what is the role of the checklist versus the story, and how do those teach different
That's
kinds
your
of
stuff right
lessons?
there, right?
Yeah.
So-
I shared that book with you.
Yeah. Well, from my understanding of it, right? So the checklist, in a lot of ways, is going to very quickly drive our thinking in one particular direction. The ambiguity and the messiness of a story is probably, like you said, over here on the other side. It tries to take away the formal processing. So the equivalent within medicine or clinical practice guidelines. This, then the decision tree, kind of like this is how you're going to move through things. And so if the problem was something that could be solved by having a pre-existing, if I do this, the next thing I should do is this, and this will lead to these things, then we're going to teach that in our training. The problem is that every day somebody gets hurt doing something dumb and new, right? Like you can't plan for all these kinds of things. And so there has to be a process that allows for the ambiguity and the complexity and the kind of unique essence of things as they emerge. So I see them both as having, you want firefighters in the type 2 entry level 130, 190 class to learn this is how you deploy a fire shelter, this is how you do these things, here's how you make these kinds of decisions. That can only get us so far, and then you're into the kind of more complex situations. We still have those functioning in the background that we hope people are using, but I guess whenever those fail, this process is then kind of ignited. I didn't see it coming, but I was pretty happy it was there. I think we had used them. I'll go over you.
So a couple things, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about people sharing these stories, right?
Mhm.
So getting these things tied into companies and groups, safety moments,
Yeah.
right? Because I come out of process control,
Mhm.
dealing with big refineries,
Yeah.
and I've actually gotten to work with Gary Klein a little bit.
Oh,
A
yeah,
little
yeah.
bit of shadow box work with him
Right on.
directly. And it's how do you get all of these things about getting the culture to move?
Mhm.
And it's great to have the tools,
Mhm.
right? But there's still this whole thing that you really focused on, which is getting people to move from where they are
Yeah.
to actually making use of those.
Yeah.
And being able to use those safety moment kinds of things gets it into a lot of places
Yeah.
because there's the vendors of the refineries
Yeah, for sure.
that the refineries are going, you guys need to have safety moments too.
Yeah. Well, I see
And these
the
are
case
people sitting
studies.
in offices.
Yeah. Well, I see case study work in organizations, and they use fire examples quite a bit, and nuclear power examples, those kinds of things. And so when people can recognize a transferable lesson, even if, I don't think that you guys are going to have to deal with, certain kinds of fire situations, but there is a parallel in your world, whatever it might be. And to recognize good learning doesn't mean that those kinds of things have to be the same. When I was prepping for this, I was talking to my friend who is a risk management safety officer, and he said, just remember, there is something that is a fire in their world. I was like, oh yes, okay, so we have to figure out how that functions. And another thing we were going to do was actually kind of work a little bit together to figure out, like, what are your equivalents to these types of things? How would, what space would you open up within your calendar to investigate, or not investigate, but to focus on learning, to create an open learning environment? How would you try and get people to be convinced that you're not going to seek, punitive kind of things?
I have a follow-on question to this gentleman's question about like access to knowledge. So
Mhm.
you brought up two situations that sparked this question. One was the 19-year-old guy in Oregon who showed you the paper
Yeah.
that you had written.
Yeah.
And the other was the concept of having a safety meeting in which they used
Yeah.
the occasional story. So how do they know these stories exist, and where do they get them from?
Email blast. They go out
That's
if you get a new. So anybody that is on the subscription, and that's pretty much everybody. You've got to get in fire. If I go places and I say, "Have you heard of the Lessons Learned Center?" Yes, because there's been some of them are really high profile, and so the Yarnell, the Granite Mountain firefighters, that one everybody heard about that, and everybody want to know, well, what was the story? Well, we got this. Where is it? What Lessons Learned Center? So almost everybody I talked to knew of Lessons Learned Center, Not all of them were familiar with RLSs, but they know about some kind of learning tool that's there. And so anytime there's a new RLS that gets posted, I get a ping, and so I find out, and I read the one, like nobody reads them all. That's just crazy town, right? But you read the ones that have things associated with the things that you've been studying or that you do, or if I'm a guy who's working on pumps, right, then I will be focused on the pump accidents, and so the other thing is that we get certain people to push out notices whenever there's one that's got a really good lesson or when it's going to answer a lot of questions. So one piece that we wrote on radio communication, and it was learning from, it was HRO, high reliability organizing, and how that sounds whenever we're doing it, which is a weird question because everybody was like, how do we process this? But no one talked about what it sounded like when we did it, so we tried to do this crazy task of figuring that out. And the fire and aviation director for FEMA picked it up and put it on the Monday blast, and so everybody had to read it. And it was, the things I write in academia, literally they did a study, at some point they did a study, never listen to people that say things like that, but you know what I mean. Like 3 people on average read our journal articles, but thousands of people had to read it because FEMA director said that one, that's the one that we want to get out.
What does HRO stand for again?
High reliability organizing. And so it's this idea that certain organizations function within these environments where there's all kinds of things that could go wrong, and yet few things do go wrong. And so, and there are 5,
Refineries.
Yeah, exactly, and fire, and aviation, and and it's built up about 5 principles. Things like you have to be preoccupied with failure, you have to defer to expertise. You have to be reluctant to simplify. There are these, techniques that you can learn about to ensure more safe kinds of activities, and that you're just being as diligent as you can at understanding the environment.
So is there a centralized repository of all these documents?
The Wildland Lessons Learned Center. So you can go through products, and it's got all the RLSs, all of the FLAs.
So it's just on the internet?
Yep.
Oh, wow. Can you get the details to whoever runs the meter group and put up a blast? Because I would love to just take a...
You will quickly be underwater. It is so not because you wouldn't understand it, because there's thousands of them.
Well,
right?
that's my thought, right? Is how do you get the right? I'm going to call it therapeutic metaphor to the right person in advance of the right situation, so that when they need it, it's there for them. Like, how do you do that?
Right? It's a fascinating. It's, in some ways, that's all of society is trying to figure that problem
Right.
out right now.
Yeah.
This is.
But you're actually
that hurts from
succeeding.
nodding yes throughout the whole thing.
Yay!
Like so
That feels like success, not failure.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're actually succeeding to some level, and that's interesting in its own right.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I think it's what makes it to where people will listen to me outside of fire, because they're like, that's some mojo right there. Like we're working on it, and we're making little successes.
Because we have so many fire metaphors,
Mm-hmm.
right? That when you tell a fire metaphor, that people have a way to apply that to what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it ties into, even Gary Klein uses those fire metaphors
Yeah.
to get people to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I picked up working with Gary is that there's novices and there's experts.
Mhm.
And I went to refineries and did usability studies. And when I went to talk to somebody that'd been being the plant operator, the guy that's in charge of everybody else sitting in the central control room, and he'd been there for a couple of years, I'd show him a graphic with information on it, and he'd look at it and say, nothing's read, it must be fine.
Mm.
And then I'd show it to somebody that had 10 years of experience. And he'd look at it, he'd pick out one number out of all these numbers on there and tell me a half-an-hour story.
Mm. Ooh, story. I like it that they
Story.
answer it through the story.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
One number,
Yeah.
there's a half-an-hour story behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Same graphic.
Yeah.
when I started this decades ago, my obsession was on the issue that all of us know we should exercise more, we should be more involved in politics, we should manage our finances better. Like all these world issues and personal issues have to do, like we know what we should do, and we don't do it, right? So it's the part of this group, of course, naturally gravitated towards. And once the lessons learned, how do we get people to do it? Which would be something we probably could have a good conversation around. But I did then start gravitating backwards over time, realizing, well, half the time when people do it, they're doing the wrong thing. And
Actually, yoga.
Yeah.
Well, because
with bad form.
And yet the interesting thing is arguably why humans have become so dominant is our superpower is not opposable thumbs, but the fact that we operate as a superorganism. We don't just learn from our own experience or gather our own resources or only protect ourselves. We are able to do that on a global level, and especially learning, especially through storytelling, like that superpower that I can, and it's literally from, as I'm sure you were alluding to, in the brain scanning, when it's a proper story, you are simulating. I mean, real life is a simulation too, so.
The storytelling stuff, like we can start with the ancients and pull
Well,
through and like.
My fire metaphor is we tell stories around the fire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the slide that I didn't get
is the
to
superpower.
has a picture of a drawing of a fire on, on the inside of a cave, right? We've been doing this for a while, trying to figure out and communicate that kind of thing. But that whole thing, and I'm plugging, if you want me to do this, I will do it in the future. This whole idea of why we should tell the stories, how central they are to our essence as humans, right? There's a whole metaphor system of homo narrans, right? The narrating animal. We use symbols, and one particular function of those symbols is to be able to tell stories, and that's something that is different about us. And that, okay, so if that's the essence of us, what is that? And then I explain what makes story, which is, you're like, I know that already. Maybe. But then also, what do we do with them? And then how do you do that, right? Because a lot of people say, well, I can't do that. I can't tell a story, or I can't write a story. But it's a skill. You can get better at it. I mean, everybody can. And it's interesting because I would have had you tonight tell stories to each other about faux pas or near misses or failures in your organization. And it's the one time in the night, this whole room would be just squawky and loud, and you'd be using your hands, and everybody comes alive to tell a story, and we're pretty good at it, and people will remember the stories. And then you sit down to write, and you could have said, in the story, man, that person, that fire scared the shit out of me. And then you write, he was scared. We take all of the life out of it because we're like government speak, and we write in a way that it reflects the tyranny of our grammar school, and we're scared of it. And we even, I was a talker. I don't know if you would have believed that or not, but I wrote a lot of sentences. I will not talk in class. I will not talk in class. So we punish students by making them write. So we grow up to hate the process, and then we're baffled by why we can't do it any better. So we unpack all those kinds of things, which, different night.
Yeah. Okay. We actually haven't had a formal storytelling focus yet as an event, so we should definitely do that. Because it's critical, and I just love how you got to there's so much that I want to ask, and two that I want to expand on, but just the fact that you called out how a single word evokes a whole story.
Yeah.
And so much in our consulting work, we're doing this kind of behavioral design stuff for all kinds of situations, and it's so funny how often it comes back to changing the copy, and often a single word makes a huge difference because now you're evoking a different story.
Oh yeah, frames. It just there's powerful invitations.
So powerful,
Exactly. Good.
So there's a Star Trek Next Generation episode called Metaphor.
Ah,
And
interesting.
Give me the outline, because I'm sure I know them all.
It's called Metaphor. The title of it is Metaphor, and it's basically Picard and this guy down on a planet, and the guy only talks in metaphor.
Sounds like my.
Picard and whoever.
I know that guy.
Sail into the sunset,
Ah.
right? And then you put that together with a couple of other pieces, right? And the whole story is metaphor, and it's figuring out that it's metaphor.
Well, it's so metaphors, totally different lecture. I'm mainly giving you like my classes, but metaphors, I call them the gold of all of rhetorical studies because it's a metaphor about metaphors.
Well, you
and
talked
people
about the guy where they just said, "Oh, that's the Frank whoever story."
Oh yeah.
Right? So they have metaphor built in.
Right. Well, it's part of the reason that it is super advantageous is whenever you hit that right metaphor, sometimes you can unlock what was previously completely unknown, and it represents the way that we learn. So if you say when in a metaphor, you're gonna learn to compare things in this area to things in this area. So you're saying, if I say life's a roller coaster, I'm trying to get you to see life as ups and downs and those kinds of things. So you're understanding one thing in terms of the other. But we do that whenever we learn all the time. So if you see something that you don't understand, you put it back against the things that you do understand. I'll tell you a story. Of course I will. Tell you a story inside the lecture on metaphors. It happens. So I had when I lived in Arkansas, I'm from Northwest Arkansas, and there was a woman, she worked at the post office, and she was from Japan, and I kind of had a passing, acquaintance with her. Anyway, So she was walking by my house, and I was having a garage sale, and my dog had treed a possum. I know there's no more Arkansas way to start a story than those combinations: garage sale and possum, and So I didn't know if are possums in Japan. I don't know, but I'm gonna take it upon myself to be an international, diplomat. And I was like, hey, come check this out. Do you want to see this possum? And she's like, Rebecca, it's a very ugly cat. And I was like, no, it's a possum. And she's like, oh, it's got tail. Its tail. It's a rat. It's a big rat. And I was like, it is not a rat. I was like, it's a possum, and you can have it for 50 cents. And she goes, oh, I can't have house pets. It was best because it's the story that always illustrates the idea that we are always using metaphor, a comparison of what we don't know to what we do know in order to embrace learning. And the story usually gets some laughs. And students at the end of the semester, they can tell that story even though they don't remember anything about metaphors. But I'm like, oh, remember, this is about how we try and make something familiar that is unfamiliar, and that's why metaphors do stick with us, and they're so powerful. And when they do, they can unlock something just in a second. I was in your fitness life, are you familiar with are you familiar with kettlebells? Right, so if you've probably seen them, it's just like they always look like if Russians work out, that's what they would work out with, or they're always the doorstop at the gym. I'm like, that's what I thought they were for. But anyway, so my trainer was teaching me to do a bicep curl, and whenever you do one with this, because it's an awkward kind of weight, you have to really kind of over exaggerate that you're throwing an uppercut. And so I did it 1,000 times wrong, and then I was like, I'm gonna throw it like an uppercut, and I threw it like an uppercut, and I did it right. And I was like, oh, you meant uppercut. Like the whole thing was there, and whenever I saw it, and then I was like, oh, now I get it, I can understand it. But it wasn't until you can crack the code when you have the metaphor that allows you to see out of it. And so those, what we're hoping is that narratives, if we can't capture it within one word, we can get people to see that learning happening through a story if it's compelling and it's well written.
So if you've been able to consult or train or work through with large corporations, how have they received it? Because it's absolutely applicable.
Well, it's been, so I've been studying fire since 2006, but it's only within the last 5 years that I've really started running with organizational learning. Mm-hmm. And so this has just been my training, within fire. And I get asked to do different kinds of things with aviation, but it's still within the Forest Service. And so really they keep me pretty busy. I'll go, I speak, this is what happens to me. Hey, Rebecca, would you like to speak? Yes. What are we talking about? Because I just want to keep going. That's also why it's terrifying. Every once in a while I'm like, what have I agreed to do? I spoke at the Fire and Aviation Leadership meeting in Washington last year, and I was like, what have I gotten myself into? Because it's pretty risky. But yeah, this is the only one so far. But hey, call me up.
Yeah,
I'll go out.
It's so applicable that I would say that's at the core problem with a lot of our clients and a lot of places I worked before the clients is that you have to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And the large organizations have such a culture of hiding that, and you get things like approved and triplicate 3 levels up.
Oh yeah.
So and in order to do that, there's already like the cost of failure, mm-hmm. both personally and just dollars, becomes too high, mm-hmm. when really you got to get the failing early.
Yeah.
And so and to be even scientific or anything about you have a testing environment, mm-hmm. You all have to overcome that.
Do you feel like you're changing the culture, or was there already a culture that invited framing things as learning versus failure?
Well, I will say every once in a while I am heartened because I see that people will say things that reflect that they're comfortable to talk about things. Mm-hmm. And then I'll see how a report or something gets smacked down, mm-hmm. and how people are still scared to talk about what they're seeing, what they're learning, and those kinds of things. The hikers that I mentioned earlier, mm-hmm. they, the helicopter crew that went to pick them up, they saved them from this fire that was approaching and got all 7 of the hikers and all 3 of the dogs out, and it was a big ordeal and a dramatic story. But that one helicopter wasn't carted to carry civilians, and so the helicopter, the helitac, the guy that was that went out and got the hikers, actually, this was the greatest feel-good story ever because no one got hurt and everyone was
Even the
happy.
dogs
And there's a
got
30-pound
sick.
chihuahua in the story.
Yeah.
Like, there's all kinds of reasons that make this the best story. And the Region 6, like the Pacific Northwest, they were like, this is so good. Let's, get it out on ABC News and, like, at least Good Morning America or something. But the helitalk manager was like, nope, I don't want this story getting out there because ultimately they did bend one of the rules in the interagency helicopter operating guide, the IHOG. But in the guide, because I'd read it, I wanted to know what I was getting them into if they were going to agree to do it. And it says, but there are exceptions. And I was like, that's a big but right there, like you're cool. But if, later on down the road, something happens and, somebody were making a decision, they say, well, they did it over there and those people got in trouble, then they would, so so sometimes you hear very disappointing things where you're like, well, I thought we were moving forward and now, I don't think this is going to be linear and I don't think that it's going to be just progress like the chart, right? It's not going to just be that. It's going to be ups and downs, but hopefully more ups than downs. And
it's just so fascinating that they've embraced this idea such that they do set the ground rules that this is not about, we're not going to blame somebody,
Yeah.
we're not going to
Right.
find fault,
Well,
we're not going to punish it.
yeah.
Because if you didn't do that, you wouldn't learn the lessons.
No. Well,
They wouldn't
and
come
we
out.
train 120 students a year. So there's 60 students in each of the week-long classes. And they have been selected partially because they can spread those ideas. So if you have a 14-person crew and we've trained one of you, 14 people get to hear what that week was like and the ideas of just culture. And so, there's been thousands of people that have gone through this class. And so, but you know what they have to do that? I'll give you a week of pay and the United States government is going to pay for you to travel to Tucson, Arizona and put you up in a hotel to learn these kinds of things. It has to be that kind of, it's not always just about money, but it wouldn't get done if there wasn't some support.
So you go through a phase of training about not blaming and not.
Yeah. So there's 2 what they call foundational principles, just culture, and there are people who spend, there's probably equal amount of time between my portions, interviewing, writing the story, facilitated group dialogue, all those kinds of techniques I talked about, and then just culture, and also a lot of human performance, human cognition, and those kinds of things. So there's, I would say on the faculty cadre for just this one workshop, there's probably 12 of us. And we break up the week into different kinds of things. We have law enforcement that comes in. We have CISM, so people who are trained specifically in dealing with PTSD, because we're going to encounter a lot of people that have gone through those things.
I was wondering.
Yeah, so we have all these kinds of experts that come in, and as they're learning something in the lecture, then that afternoon we're going to say, okay, now we have different simulation case studies, and we know exactly where they're going to mess up, which is always fun to watch. But they're learning how to do interviews and create good open questions and ask probing questions that get more information and those kinds of things. And so they're having to put into practice the things they learn. And they also, this was a really good class, and I am lucky to be a part of it. And I'm also very proud to have gotten to kind of work to unify the curriculum. So I can say when I go in there, everything that you learn in the curriculum is something you can apply in the simulation. And if you don't see where that crossover is taking place, you need to have your hand in the air and hold us accountable, because you need to be able to know what you're learning. And believe me, firefighters go through enough training where it begins like this. I'm good at this part. So I'm not really a teacher, even though they're one that's standing up there and they're teaching, but they don't embrace that. So that's the first thing. And then they say, I'm sorry, this is going to be death by PowerPoint. So we are set not to listen and to be passive and to hate training and not to do a very good job. So when you tell things like, hold us accountable, if you don't understand this and this, people are kind of, it's a surprise, and they hear like it's real, or they meant to do this. That's what they write on our evaluations, is that it was like intentionally thought out, and they take something with it. I've been to a lot of trainings where you didn't.
Do you know of a YouTube science educator named Derek Mueller?
I don't think so.
YouTube channel is called Veritasium.
Okay.
He literally has a PhD in teaching physics through video.
Oh, right on.
So in the course of putting together his PhD thesis, he had to do a lot of experimentation about how people learn. And he actually has empirical evidence that if you want someone to pay attention to what you're teaching them, you have to find some way of telling them that what they know is wrong. And if you don't do that,
Yeah.
they don't pay enough attention to learn anything.
Yeah. Well, it's so there's different ways that we approach this from pedagogy, but you know I'm gonna get Burke on this, right? So it's gonna have to be some Kenneth Burke here. So there's actually he's a literary critic, but I like what he does with this notion of form. He says this the whole idea of being persuasive, getting somebody to believe whatever you're trying to tell them, is I'll give you the quote. He says, it's the creation of the appetite in the minds of the auditors and the adequate satisfying of that appetite. So I can do that in a way where I make you uncomfortable. I can give you cognitive dissonance where you didn't even realize you're a hypocrite and all of a sudden you are, right? Or I can create something where I didn't even know I needed that, and now I can't live another day without a Swiffer or whatever, right? Like, so you create the appetite because you have the answer to the what you've created. And I think sometimes what does kind of catch people up is when they think that they've seen something that's correct in the world, and you're like, not quite, and that helps. Or to and the other part of that though, there is an authenticity that I think people respond to. So sometimes it's making people uncomfortable, and sometimes it's being and this is one of the most quotable quotes from Dr. Rebecca Fox, be a human in front of a human, right? Like, you can see the failures on me, you can hear me talk about those things, and it's disarming. It's another way I think people kind of learn is when you are vulnerable and authentic and willing to let them see that. People want that even more so than somebody who's palatable. Right? You could probably guess, I'm not everybody's cup of tea. And that's okay, because what people will say is that they think I'm an authentic person. And so, with students, a lot of times we tell new teachers, don't ever talk about politics in the classroom. I teach classes on ideological criticism. We're going to talk about politics in the classroom. They don't ever have to agree with me. They just have to see that I'm not trying to fake things. And that's what they respond to, even more than if they disagree with something, is that they see me being a real person.
And actually, if I may, I'd like to rewind a bit, because you brought up that whole startup culture ethos about fail fast, fail often. And that whole ethos is badly misunderstood by the vast majority of people. And the guy who says it best is a guy named Ash Mora, who wrote a book called Running Lean. I don't know if you've, but it's not about failing. Failing is not the goal. You don't want to get people into a culture of where they brag about what they failed at. Like, that's not the goal. It's really all about test, test, test.
Right.
Like, state your assumptions, turn it into a testable hypothesis, test it, and if it failed, move on. Right? So fail for $500 a pop, so that you don't have to fail for 50 million later.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
Instead of, you see a lot of testing that is deliberately trying to avoid the big assumptions because they don't want to.
Right.
You do want to test to find the failure cases. And
Right.
so it's not like you want to fall flat on your face or destroy the
And
company.
yet I've
You-
had conversations
but you
with
need
people
real
who have
testing.
bragged
Be
about their
honest.
expensive failures. Like, you sort of missed the point here.
Yeah. That's the
Fail cheap and quick and
fail cheap
exactly.
and
move
Fast.
on.
In fact, fail fast, fail often is probably better restated, fail cheap.
Fail.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is kind of this dichotomy of companies that are over aggressive about failure and pivots. But I think the vast majority, the Fortune 500s, there might be some people that say fail, great, let's fail frequently or fail quickly. But the vast majority of failure is still a really bad word, and I love the language around,
Right.
You kind of gave a peek behind the curtain to us in many ways, but I get the sense that your vocabulary with the Forest Service is not about failure whatsoever. It's all about learning.
Learning from the unintended outcomes.
Right.
And we don't even say, I used to, before I was really involved in it. It's like learning from unintended consequences, but that's too active.
Right.
It's an unintended outcome, and we can learn. This gives you the opportunity to learn from good ones, right? We don't. That's not as easy because you would think that learning from success, you're like, wow, that was a great example. It's not going to stick with you. Sometimes it has to disrupt, right? Like learning from things that go wrong, that will stick with you a lot more than the, hey, things went great. Those are
I
fleeting.
don't need no stinking PPE.
Plus, yeah. Plus, though, it's really hard to isolate what was the right thing that happened to lead to the overall of all the rightness. You know, like it's hard to even get to that. But yeah, the language associated with those unintended outcomes. I mean, I saw a really cool FLA written. I don't even remember who it was. It was a long time ago when I read it. But there was a guy who had to have knee surgery, and he took his laptop with him into the surgical suite, and somebody stole it. And he's the guy, and this is several years ago, he has to hit one button so that all the people in the Forest Service can get paid. And his laptop was gone, and he was in the hospital. And so it was like, how do we learn from that? You know, like, oh yeah, but you can do these learning reviews on just absolutely anything that, takes place. But that was a really interesting one. Yeah, that is a fire. That is a fire. That is an explosion of a fire, yeah.
We're also designing stuff around helping people do habits, like Under Armour's app and things like that.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, it's like, well, if you didn't follow through or meet your goal, okay, what could you learn from that to improve on? But you're also like, well, even if it went well,
yep.
you could reflect back and say, well, how could you have improved your routine anyway?
Yeah.
There's still knowledge,
And it's the stuff that's underneath the surface, that tacit knowledge. Because so last year when I did there was a tree strike. So there was a guy out and he was cutting down trees, and there was a tree directly across from him, and he cut his sequence. Like he knew exactly which tree he was going to cut in what order and that kind of thing. His nickname was Woodchuck. He's like the little tree whisperer, and he's like this tall, and he had a white guy fro, and he was a great Forest Service employee. Anyway, he cut down this tree. It landed where he thought it was, but he couldn't see on the ground because there was ash over the bottom of the tree to know that tree was next to it was burned out. So he drops it, it hits the ground, and the one next to it comes back and hits him. It cracks his hard hat. That's 1,000 pounds of pressure to crack a hard hat. So he was just lucky to be alive. And so we went there thinking we were going to learn all this stuff about, sequins and cutting down trees and all that kind of stuff. And really it was a team the crew was made up of almost all military veterans. I think actually all of them were military veterans. And they had really sophisticated medical response that we are not doing in the Forest Service. And okay, I say sophisticated. It's not. It's basic. We should all be doing it. It's ridiculous that we don't. So they had, usually when you have a crew, you've got one person who's the line medic, and that person has the medical equipment, and so that if you're hurt out there with a chainsaw or something, then they can very quickly, help you. But if the line medic goes off the side of the mountain, all your medical equipment just went outside the mountain. So they got food saver bags, and they made these little tiny bags of gauze, quick clot, which is just a clotting agent, a tourniquet, and gloves. And all of them had it in their line gear. So if you get hurt, one of these isn't going to save you, but if 13 people arrive with them. So it was spreading out all the medical equipment. They also had, get this, identification cards. We don't have that. We don't have dog tags or anything like that. So you have one person, if your burn boss or whoever it is, if that person falls off the mountain, your next of kin, like whoever your point of contact, your allergies, nobody knows that anymore. And so they made these little laminated cards. And so we were able to, the story had nothing to do with the tree strike. It had all to do with what we found that these folks were doing about their medical preparation, medical response that was unique, but they just assumed everybody else did it. And no, they did not. That one got a lot of traction because easy to implement. People were like, oh. And here's how you know an idea is a good one. I love to say something so bold in a place this rich with ideas. Here's how you know. Because everybody thinks that it already exists. Right? It's just ridiculous because of its elegance. You're like, well, I'm sure we do that, right? Nope. Huh. That's great, So it's just the one that you just assume happens already. The learning isn't always what you go for. It's what you are really taking that is transferable.
Right. Well, I feel like you have such an amazing view on all this because it feels like you're a polymath on it. Like you're pulling together a lot of different subjects together. So I'm really curious, like, what came from your degrees, what came from other experiences in your life, like, where'd you come from?
That's what I was telling Jamie earlier. It is a weird one, right? It's a kind of, Okay, so my undergrad and my master's degree are in communication studies, and actually I was studying rhetoric and film, right, as master's student. So I was learning how to do like psychoanalytic criticism of film and those kinds of things, and I was also studying free speech. So those were the two main communication things that I was focused in.
Free speech, as in like the
First Amendment.
concept.
Yep. Yeah.
Wow.
So that was, and that's still something I teach. I teach a class called Free Speech and Extremism. And so that's, history of and philosophy of freedom of speech and democracy, and then also a look at extremist groups. Because technically my PhD is in the rhetoric of social movements. So mass protests and persuading, like, how is it that individuals can get large groups of people to follow what they're doing?
That's what I'm
Nothing
trying to
like
do.
organizational learning. There's a lot of overlap,
Yeah,
a
but
lot.
there's that negative in there, right, that draws people in to think about it and
Yeah,
remember it, right?
right.
Organizational learning, who cares?
Well, and I didn't know really that I was going to go down. I had no idea I was going to do this stuff. This was very unique. And so, right as I was, probably my second year in my PhD program, I picked up an emphasis on organizational communication, because at that time, for me, with what I was doing with social movements, and I could look very easily at labor. So organizational communication and social movements, what's the natural intersection? It has to do with labor organizing. And so I was interested in, I looked at years and years of labor movements in multiple countries and that kind of stuff. And so I probably say stuff a lot for a person who has a PhD, but I just heard it. Anyway, so I had exactly. I had a professor at the time who was studying, she taught a class called Power and Control in Organizations. And I've always been a little bit drawn to not the nice, like relational communication and happy things, but like, what is this pulling over our eyes, critical theory kind of stuff. And so I took that class, and she was studying how when there are investigations in organizations, how they aim, or that they, most of the time, the way they're conducted will blame the individual. And so her genre of communication was accident investigation. And she was looking at, or she had our class look at one fire. We looked at the Kramer fire from 2003, and we learned all of the theories and principles and concepts of power and control in organizations through the lens of that one fire. And there were 8 of us in that seminar, and we all went to firefighting conferences after that. And we're like, here's what we learned about your Kramer fire. And they're like, why are these Midwestern nerds trying to tell us about our fires? And yet, that's very interesting. And so that just gave me other opportunities. I edited the International Association of Wildland Fire journals and the International Association of Wildland Fire conference proceedings. And so I had a hand at editing authors' work that were writing about fire. That was my secret fire education. Because if I was going to tell somebody that they needed to improve their writing, I had to learn to well, what's a hectare? And I had to learn a lot. And I think the people that had done that editing work previously, it was very technical, but they weren't doing argument analysis. And so I was like, you don't support this claim. And people all over where, because these are international, they're like, no one's ever paid attention to my writing. And they, would say things like, you made this sound better. And so I realized that I was interacting with people in a different way. And that gave me a lot of other opportunities. People were like, put your eyes on this and go review this, and just kept saying yes when people asked me to do things. I've gone on staff rides, which is another kind of learning review, where we literally get in buses and we move from one place to the next that would have mimicked the how a day unfolded. And we hike, we get on our PPE, and we hike up to where the fires would have been to see what people can see, so that, it's easy to judge someone in a particularly complex situation when you're reading something, but then when you get up there and you're like, oh yeah, you really can't see very far, and it is gusty up here, or whatever, then you have a better chance of really understanding it. So that's like the gold standard of the learning review, is the staff ride. It's, military kind of thing, but we do it with fire too. And I first got asked to write about a white paper on the communication environment associated with the staff ride. Like, did we actually do learning? And so
staff ride?
I'm sorry?
A staff ride?
Ride, like a ride along, so your staff, or those kind, whoever, and we're gonna go out and we're gonna ride from place to place. So you start, everybody was at the heli base, then we move to this place, and then we get out and we hike, and people are doing sense making, but they're also, it's supposed to be kind of therapeutic, because people that are going through trauma or that had gone through trauma are doing it in a space where it's kind of protected, and they get to kind of go to the place that holds all that negative emotion and experience something different. And so you can kind of, maybe they don't get left in that unsettling place, but they can move through it, or at least we hope that's kind of what it's doing. And so I wrote a report about, how to create an open communication environment in a staff ride, which is hard because there's a lot of people that are mad at each other and, blaming a lot of people and that kind of thing. I learned in that one, though, that sometimes as a consultant, they don't want to hear the truth. That was a fun lesson.
Imagine that.
Yeah, I was like, I may never get asked back, but it was, needed to say it, and I did get asked back. Yeah, you gotta figure out where the edges are.
I try to set it up as like one of the values I feel like I can bring to you is I can say things that nobody inside the organization
Exactly.
can say. Kind of, do I have your permission to
Yeah.
play that role? And
Exactly.
like, sure. Then you're like, okay, I'm not gonna tell you the truth, but
Yep. I'm gonna.
yeah.
Well, that and leaking reports. Figuring out who your people are on the inside that you think should hear messages and just put them out there.
Man, you're blowing my mind.
Haha, yay!
That's awesome.
I'm succeeding and failing. Yeah.
Do you consider in your bag of tricks this thing we call, I'm not an expert, but behavioral design?
So I don't know a lot about behavioral design. I know that there's a lot of overlap when people usually say that term with what I would consider organizational communication. So whenever we're thinking about how to design things in such a way that goes in step with how humans are naturally going to be, instead of forcing them into acting in ways that are unnatural, that's going to be a losing battle most of the time. And so if that's kind of part of it, is based on human behavior, how we're going to design things to work in a better way. I have an interest in that because that's where humans, it's where we interface. A lot of times when we're talking about communication and socialization, all those kinds of things. That design is going to both influence it and be a product of it. So I guess in that way, that's what I would see as my connection to it. But I can learn more.
This may be your next.
Yeah, I like it.
Wow.
I like it. I think we have kept you late, super late, but this has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
That was on fire.
Yeah, smoking.
Incendiary.
Yeah, sweet. Oh wait, okay, whose clicker?
Sparky.
Okay, Sparky. Oh, that is perfect. That is perfect. So whenever I go out into the field, when you call in on the radio, you say your last name, or you say your position, and then you say your last name, and because I'm on safety crew, so